What if I told you America's weirdest historical moments aren't buried in conspiracy forums? They're hiding in plain sight, inside dusty government archives, military memoirs, and NASA mission logs. Camels in the cavalry, missiles guided by pigeons, a plan to nuke the moon. This isn't alternative history, it's actual history, and it's absolutely unhinged. Welcome to 103 of the weirdest, wildest, and most wonderfully stupid facts from U.S. history, where the truth isn't just stranger than fiction. It often is fiction, but with paperwork. Buckle up. It only gets weirder from here. Benedict Arnold's gunboat parade on Lake Champlain. Before he became the most famous snitch in American history, a Benedict Arnold was busy being oddly competent. In 1776, he helped design and command a makeshift flotilla of tiny wooden gunboats on Lake Champlain. Yes, Lake Champlain, not exactly Pearl Harbor. But these boats, hastily stapled together with hope and desperation, managed to delay a much larger British force. Arnold's ragtag Navy didn't win any medals or get a Netflix series, but they did slow the enemy long enough for winter to roll in and freeze everything solid. In other words, America was saved by procrastination and Canadian weather. Historians often skip over this chapter because it's hard to dramatize a bunch of freezing men slowly sinking in leaky boats, while Arnold shouts naval commands like a man who just learned what starboard means. Still, for one weird moment, he wasn't a traitor, just a guy in a hat trying to keep the British from floating south too quickly. Of course, he'd later sell out the Revolution for some cash and a fancy British uniform. But hey, everyone needs a retirement plan. And speaking of ill-fated plans involving odd modes of transportation, the U.S. Navy's brief romance with camels. In the 1850s, the U.S. Navy looked at the brutal terrain of the American Southwest and had a thought. What if camels? Yes, the ship guys, not the Army, the Navy, desert camels. The brainchild of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who would later apply his logistical genius to the Confederacy. The Camel Corps was America's short-lived attempt at turning the Southwest into a Saharan fantasy. They imported dozens of camels from the Middle East, slapped saddles on them, and tried to convince skeptical soldiers that this was totally normal. Turns out, the camels were good at hauling heavy loads across dry landscapes. Unfortunately, they were also loud, moody, and had zero chill around horses, which, as it happens, made up most of the U.S. military's emotional support system at the time. Troops hated them. Horses hated them. The project was eventually scrapped, and the camels were either sold off or set loose to roam the deserts of Texas, where for years people claimed to see ghost camels wandering the dunes. Because of course America has phantom camels. And yet, that wasn't even the weirdest thing floating around on U.S. military assets in the 1800s. USS Constitution and her bouncing cannonballs. Imagine you're a British sailor in the War of 1812. You fire your cannon at a big American ship and boing, the cannonball bounces off. Not explodes, bounces. That's what happened when the USS Constitution entered battle. Her oaken hull was so absurdly thick and tightly packed, cannonballs literally bounced off the sides like she was cosplaying as a cast-iron bathtub. One astonished sailor supposedly yelled, "Her sides are made of iron!" And boom, nickname secured. Old Ironsides. Of course, she was made of wood. But not just any wood, a Frankenstein layering of live oak, white oak, and a whole lot of nautical overconfidence. It worked. The Constitution beat the British HMS Guerriere into floating confetti, helping boost American morale during a war that, if we're honest, was mostly an awkward sequel to the Revolution. She's still around today, mostly docked, occasionally floated, and always romanticized in recruitment videos. But in 1812, she wasn't just a symbol, she was a 44-gun floating paradox. A ship made of wood that didn't know how to sink. Which brings us to another structure that didn't quite stick to the standard blueprint. The Pentagon was almost a hexagon. Before the Pentagon became a symbol of military might, surveillance budgets, and unnerving symmetry, it very nearly had 6 sides. Yes, the Department of War, which was its actual name back then, like a Bond villain's HR department, almost built their headquarters as a hexagon. Why? Because the original proposed site near Arlington Cemetery was shaped like a misshapen pancake, and a hexagon allegedly fit better. Practical? Maybe. Intimidating? Less so. A hexagon feels more like a board game tile than the command center of a global superpower. Eventually, someone realized that building a geometrically confusing monument to American bureaucracy on a cemetery's doorstep might be, let's say, bad optics. So they changed the location, kept the symmetry fetish, and landed on 5 sides instead of 6. Thus, the Pentagon was born. A concrete labyrinth that houses more secrets, coffee shops, and filing cabinets than any building should legally contain. But still, somewhere in an alternate timeline, America is run from a hexagon. Just imagine the conspiracy theories. And if you think building-shaped symbolism is weird, wait until you hear about the guys who used inflatable tanks, fake radio signals, and sound effects to fight Nazis. The beach jumpers and their theatrical invasions. World War II had its fair share of cinematic moments. D-Day landings, dogfights, and General Patton monologuing like he was auditioning for Shakespeare in armor. But few wartime episodes felt quite as theatrical as the beach jumpers. These guys were basically military illusionists, trained to make the enemy believe a massive invasion was happening. Somewhere it absolutely wasn't. They'd show up in small boats, blaring pre-recorded naval battles from loudspeakers, spewing out radar-reflecting foil to mimic a fleet, and faking radio chatter like a bunch of improv actors who majored in Morse code. Their whole job was to trick the Germans into looking left when the real invasion came from the right. Misdirection, military edition. Sometimes it worked brilliantly. Other times, not so much. War, after all, isn't an exact science. But the beach jumpers proved that a well-placed illusion could win battles. And honestly, it's kind of comforting to know the military had a team of chaos agents who basically weaponized special effects. But if you're wondering how low-tech things could get in contrast to this sonic deception squad, wait until you meet the war heroes with feathers. The medal-winning pigeons of the U.S. military. Before encrypted emails, satellite uplinks, or even fax machines, there were pigeons. Yes, actual pigeons, with little tubes strapped to their legs, tasked with flying through a literal gunfire to deliver handwritten messages. The U.S. military used them extensively in both world wars, proving that even in the age of tanks and bombs, sometimes what you really need is a flying envelope with feathers. These weren't just any birds. They were elite, highly trained, and treated better than some privates. They could fly through smoke, explosions, and storms, often arriving bloodied but unbroken. One particularly famous pigeon named Cher Ahmed delivered a critical message in World War I despite being shot, blinded in one eye, and having one leg hanging by a tendon. They gave him a medal. He deserved more. It's the kind of story that feels like myth, but it's not. America really did rely on birds with built-in Jeep, and they worked. It's honestly a little humbling to realize that for all our advanced tech, victory once rested on a bird who didn't know it was in a war. And while the pigeons were busy dodging bullets, a different kind of genius was secretly building something far more explosive. The Manhattan Project, a secret so big, no one knew what they were doing. The Manhattan Project was less a single event and more a sprawling countrywide improv act where thousands of scientists collaborated on the most destructive invention in human history. Without being told what they were actually building, imagine going to work every day splitting atoms in suspiciously secure basements, while your boss says, "Don't ask questions, Just make it go boom. That was the vibe. Even within the same facility, departments were isolated. If you asked too many questions, you weren't promoted. You were politely removed. The phrase need-to-know basis wasn't just a guideline. It was gospel. Scientists later described working for years on sub-projects with no idea they were helping construct a weapon that could erase entire cities in seconds. Security was so tight that Vice President Truman didn't learn about the bomb until after he became president. You know your top-secret project is airtight when it excludes the guy next in line to run the country. When the bomb finally went off in the desert at Trinity, some scientists wept. Others cheered. A few quietly realized they'd just signed humanity's permission slip for apocalypse. And then, while the atom was being split in secret, someone else was accidentally inventing computer science. With a moth. The first computer bug was literally a bug. In 1947, deep in the glowing vacuum tube guts of the Mark II Aiken relay calculator, one of the earliest computers, a problem arose. The machine wasn't working properly. A team investigated. And there, stuck between the circuits, was a dead moth. That's right. The first computer bug was an actual literal insect. And so, a tech term was born not from metaphor, but entomology. Grace Hopper, one of the pioneers of computing, and a woman who could code rings around her male colleagues while making naval officers cry, taped the moth into her logbook with the deadpan caption, "First actual case of bug being found." This was long before anyone had to worry about Wi-Fi routers or disappearing files named Final V27, Final Real, this time.x. Ironically, this goofy little moment gave rise to the term debugging, which now covers everything from fixing billion-dollar AI to figuring out why your printer thinks it's offline when it clearly isn't. It's poetic. Our digital world, birthed in war, math, and molten glass tubes, brought low by a bug, with wings and terrible timing. But speaking of people who liked water more than circuits and weren't afraid to get weird about it, let's talk about a founding father with flippers, Benjamin Franklin. Inventor, founding father, swim fin enthusiast. Yes, Benjamin Franklin helped draft the Declaration of Independence, tamed lightning, and embodied Enlightenment thinking. But did you know he also invented swim fins? Not in his retirement. Not after a long diplomatic stint in France. As a teenager. Because that's how Franklin rolled. A polymath who, in between inventing bifocals and seducing half of Europe, was improving water sports. He designed the fins to fit over the hands, not feet, essentially giving swimmers turbo paddles. It's what you'd expect from a man who viewed electricity as a fun toy and considered nudity part of a balanced breakfast. Franklin was also an avid swimmer, a skill he considered so vital he once offered to open a swimming school in London. He didn't because, revolution. This might seem like a quirky footnote, but Franklin's obsession with physical self-improvement reflected his whole worldview. Master your environment, invent your way out of problems, and never trust still water. It's probably hiding something. And while Franklin was gliding through colonial waters like an Enlightenment dolphin, centuries later, the U.S. military would take its own dive into animal-assisted underwater adventures. With slightly more tactical intentions, the U.S. Navy's underwater circus, dolphins and sea lions on active duty. The Cold War was full of weird experiments, but few rival the moment when the U.S. Navy turned to dolphins and sea lions and asked, "Want to help us win?" And somehow, they said yes, or at least didn't bite. These marine mammals were trained to locate underwater mines, retrieve sunken equipment, and even tag enemy divers with marker buoys. Picture a dolphin stealthily flanking a Soviet frogman in the murky depths and tagging him like it's underwater laser tag. That's not fiction. That was military protocol. Dolphins' natural sonar abilities made them ideal for detecting objects hidden in the sand or murky water. Sea lions, with their sharp vision and underwater dexterity, were recruited for object retrieval and, allegedly, detaining intruders. If this feels like a James Bond fever dream with extra flippers, you're not wrong. Of course, the ethics of militarized marine mammals are complicated. The Navy insists the animals were treated well, but whether or not they had a union is still unclear. Either way, somewhere in a government binder, there are real reports of dolphins earning medals while outswimming scuba divers, which naturally leads us to an earlier moment in American military innovation, when intelligence was lifted not from below the waves, but above the clouds, hot air balloons and Civil War espionage. Long before drones, spy planes, and satellite surveillance, the U.S. Army thought, what if we float? Enter the Union Army Balloon Corps, an airborne reconnaissance program launched during the Civil War. Soldiers were hoisted hundreds of feet into the air in hot air balloons, where they'd sketch enemy positions and send down reports via telegraph or, seriously, handwritten notes dropped to the ground. The idea came from Thaddeus Lowe, a scientist, balloonist, and full-time chaos merchant who convinced President Lincoln to take a ride in one of his contraptions. Lincoln, reportedly terrified and probably rethinking his life choices, endorsed the project anyway. Thus began the short, strange era of battlefield blimps. The balloons were surprisingly effective, providing early aerial views of Confederate troop movements. But they were also giant, slow-moving targets tethered to the ground by visible ropes, basically floating shoot-me signs. Confederate forces weren't impressed with the innovation so much as the easy practice shots. The program was eventually scrapped due to logistical nightmares, interdepartmental squabbles, and general 19th century chaos. But for a brief moment, the war had a bird's-eye view. And speaking of altitude, the next group to take to the skies wasn't using fabric and fire. They were strapped into rockets. Test pilots become astronauts. The original space cowboys. When NASA first went shopping for astronauts, they didn't look for scientists, philosophers, or dreamy-eyed stargazers. They wanted men who had already flirted with death in experimental aircraft. And so, America's first astronauts came straight out of the military test pilot pool. Adrenaline junkies with nerves of steel, questionable hobbies, and a near-suicidal love of speed. These were guys who had spent their careers hurtling through the atmosphere in machines held together by bolts, duct tape, and military optimism. They were trained to stay calm at Mach 2, diagnose an engine failure while upside down, and land with both bones and egos intact. In short, perfect material for being strapped to a rocket filled with volatile fuel and aimed at the sky. The Mercury 7, NASA's first astronaut class, were celebrities before they even left the atmosphere. But behind the grins and patriotic PR were men with one foot in the cockpit and the other in the grave. Space was the next frontier, sure. But for these guys, it was just Tuesday. And as America was dreaming of the stars, it was also teaching school children how to survive their arrival. With desks and questionable optimism, duck and cover, the art of surviving a nuclear fireball by hiding under your desk. In the grand tradition of hope is not a plan, the United States government during the Cold War rolled out one of the most unintentionally hilarious, yet existentially bleak public safety campaigns in history: duck and cover. The idea was simple. If you saw a nuclear flash, you were to drop to the ground, cover your head, and, presumably, pray that the atomic shockwave respected classroom furniture. Children across the country were drilled in this ritual with the fervor of fire drills, but the stakes of Armageddon. Animated turtles and chipper voiceovers reassured young minds that crouching under a wooden desk might save them from being atomized. It was government-sanctioned optimism dressed as civil defense. Part distraction, part placebo, all denial. Of course, anyone remotely familiar with nuclear physics knows that no desk on Earth is going to protect you from a 1,000-degree pressure wave followed by radioactive fallout. But hey, at least you'd be vaporized in the fetal position. There's a kind of dignity in that. Still, if you thought arming children with cartoons against nuclear weapons was strange, Wait till you hear about the brief, brave era when the U.S. Army handed its soldiers roller skates. Roller skating soldiers of the U.S. Army. Somewhere in the deeply buried vault of Pentagon regret sits the record of one of the U.S. Army's shortest and most tragic flirtations with mobility innovation. Combat roller skates. Yes, roller skates. On soldiers with guns. Because nothing says lethal efficiency like a platoon of armed men wobbling across asphalt like they're late for roller disco. The experiment occurred in the early 20th century when military planners were desperate to improve infantry mobility without relying on gasoline, horses, or logic. Soldiers were issued skates and tasked with zooming, or rather cautiously rolling, across training grounds in hopes of covering more ground faster. Theoretically, it could work. In reality, it was a slapstick death trap. Imagine trying to take cover in a firefight while moving like a confused mall cop. Turns out, tactical skating is not easy. One stumble and you're face first on the pavement, probably shooting yourself in the ankle. Unsurprisingly, this innovation didn't make it past testing, although it did leave behind some truly haunting training photos. Yet somehow, the Army wasn't done with odd transportation ideas. Because before roller skates were a military liability, the U.S. had already tried something far stranger. A one-man underwater bomb capsule made of oak and hope. The Turtle, America's first submarine and first naval disappointment, before submarines became sleek, silent death machines lurking beneath the sea. There was the Turtle. And it was exactly as awkward as it sounds. Built by David Bushnell during the American Revolution, the Turtle was a one-man wooden submersible that looked like a half-barrel mated with a walnut. Its mission? Sneak up to British ships in New York Harbor and screw a bomb into their hulls. By hand, the operator had to pump air manually, steer with a primitive propeller, and somehow not drown. All while hoping the British Navy didn't notice the bobbing wooden death pod bumping into their hull. On its maiden mission, the Turtle approached the HMS Eagle, but failed to attach the explosive. Depending on the account, it either couldn't penetrate the hull, or the pilot panicked and bailed. The bomb eventually drifted away and exploded harmlessly, a fitting metaphor for the entire venture. Still, it was the first recorded attempt at underwater naval warfare by the U.S., and for that, it earns a bizarre little place in military history. It didn't win battles, but it did prove one thing. Americans were already inventing overly complicated ways to blow things up. Speaking of complicated, wait until we get to flying incendiary bats. Bat bombs, America's flaming mammals of mass destruction. At the height of World War II, someone in the U.S. military looked at bats and thought, "You know what would make these better? Napalm." Thus was born the beautifully deranged idea of the bat bomb, a plan to strap tiny incendiary devices onto Mexican free-tailed bats, pack them into canisters, and drop them over Japanese cities at dawn. The bats would roost in attics and eaves, and then, kaboom, entire districts would ignite from within. It was the kind of idea that screams too much coffee, not enough oversight. The mastermind behind this plot was a dental surgeon named Lytle S. Adams, because of course it was. Who else would pitch a concept so wildly out of pocket that it almost made flaming pigeons seem reasonable? Testing actually got surprisingly far. The bats were frozen to sleep, dropped mid-air, and expected to awaken mid-descent. Spoiler, they didn't always. Once, they escaped during testing and burned down an Army airfield in New Mexico. Eventually, the project was scrapped in favor of a more efficient horror, the atomic bomb. But somewhere, in some Pentagon file, there's documentation proving the U.S. military once tried to fight a war using mammals as living Zippo, and while bats fell from the sky, another American took to the moon. With a golf club, Alan Shepard hits a golf ball on the moon. Only in America could the first man on the moon be followed by the first man to tee off on it. During the Apollo 14 mission, astronaut Alan Shepard, a Navy test pilot turned cosmic wisecracker, brought along a modified 6-iron and a couple of golf balls. Because when you're walking on a lifeless rock 238,000 miles from Earth, naturally, the next step is to turn it into a country club. Shepard waited until mission objectives were complete, more or less, then secretly pulled out the club head, attached it to a lunar scoop handle, and hit 2 balls into the infinite sand trap that is space. His first shot was a flop. The second? A respectable slice into the unknown. Miles and miles and miles, he quipped over the radio, possibly becoming the first golfer to use poetic license on another celestial body. NASA wasn't thrilled. This wasn't exactly by the book, but the public loved it. It was absurd, bold, and impossibly American. Conquer the moon, then casually play through. The balls are still there, by the way, slowly gathering moon dust and existential symbolism. And while Shepard brought golf to the void, another acronym was quietly branding itself into legend back on Earth. SEALSC, air, land, and total badasses. The Navy SEALs didn't get their name from the animal, though the image of a deadly flippered commando is admittedly compelling. The name is an acronym, SEA, air, and land, the 3 domains in which these guys are trained to ruin your day. Founded in 1962 under President Kennedy, the SEALs were designed to be the military's all-terrain strike force. Amphibious ghosts with assault rifles, able to swim into your kitchen, rappel out your attic, and disappear before your dog finishes barking. They trace their lineage back to the frogmen of World War II, demolition experts who cleared obstacles before beach landings. But the modern SEAL is a whole different beast. Grueling training? Check. Ice-cold ocean swims at 4 a.m.? You bet. Buddies puking next to you while instructors scream about sand in your shoelaces? It's tradition. But beyond the mythos and movie deals lies a very real group of specialists built to do the impossible. High-risk hostage rescues, counter-terrorism operations, and secret missions that probably won't be declassified until we're all living on Mars. And while they mastered land, sea, and air, the warriors who came before them had to master something a little more old school, the night sky. With a sextant, celestial navigation, when getting lost was an art form. Before GPS, before satellites, before that annoyed voice on your phone told you to make a U-turn, sailors had to find their way across oceans using math, luck, and the stars. It was called celestial navigation, and it was exactly as complicated as it sounds. Part science, part sorcery, and all dependent on not dropping your sextant overboard. To navigate, seafarers used the positions of the sun, moon, and stars, along with nautical almanacs and instruments that looked like rejected steampunk prototypes. A single cloudy night could throw everything off. One misread angle? Congratulations! You've just discovered an island that doesn't exist and lost 3 weeks of rations. And yet, it worked. For centuries, the ability to read the heavens meant life or death on the water. American naval officers trained rigorously in it, scribbling calculations while their ships rocked violently under them. Every journey was a gamble played against the cosmos. There's something oddly noble about that. The idea that warships, hulking machines of steel and cannon, were still guided by starlight. And even as radar and computers took over, the romance of celestial navigation lingered like a quiet heartbeat beneath the surface. Meanwhile, back on land, another military unit was reshaping America. One dam at a time, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Builders, flood tamers, lighthouse enthusiasts. Most military branches measure success in battles won or enemies vanquished. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers measures theirs in concrete poured and rivers redirected. While everyone else was storming beaches, the Corps was building them, and then installing flood control systems to make sure they stayed put. This isn't your average construction crew. Since its founding in the early days of the Republic, the Corps has quietly shaped much of the country's physical landscape. Dams, that's them. Levees, canals, harbors, airfields, military bases, and even lighthouses, also them. In many ways, they're the reason America looks the way it does. Functional, fortified, and suspiciously symmetrical. They don't get the action movie treatment. No one's writing a blockbuster about a guy designing a spillway. But make no mistake, they're everywhere. When a hurricane hits, they're there. When a river floods, they're already upstream, taking measurements and yelling at nature. In the great game of American power projection, the core builds the board. They are quite literally the foundation. And while they were laying down rebar, another steel beast was being born. A floating nuclear leviathan designed to never refuel. Ever. The USS Enterprise, CVN-65. The nuclear-powered sea fortress. Launched in 1960, the USS Enterprise CVN-65 was not just a ship. It was a statement, a floating city of steel and radiation that could circumnavigate the globe without ever stopping for gas. As the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, it could theoretically sail for 20 years without refueling its reactors. That's right, 20 years of uninterrupted floating menace. It was over 1,000 feet long, with a flight deck capable of launching planes faster than some countries could pronounce aerodynamics. And powered by 8 nuclear reactors, it basically sneered at the concept of fuel logistics. This wasn't just an aircraft carrier. It was Poseidon's office complex. Sailors called her Big E, a name that sounded like a friendly diner, but masked the fact that she could launch airstrikes across continents. She served for over 50 years, projecting American power from Vietnam to the Middle East. And with all that reactor-powered stamina, she made traditional fleets feel like gas-guzzling dinosaurs. But perhaps most amazing was this. Even with all that nuclear energy and military genius, there was once a serious proposal to use that power for something far pettier. Something lunar. Something unhinged. Project A119. The totally sane plan to nuke the moon. In the 1950s, during the height of Cold War panic and who's got the bigger missile energy, the U.S. Air Force floated a plan so utterly deranged it almost sounds made up. Detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon. No, not at someone on the moon. On the moon itself. Why? Because they could. And because they wanted the Soviet Union, and probably the entire galaxy, to know that America was willing to flex so hard it would punch the moon just to make a point. This plan, known internally as Project A119, was more about optics than tactics. A well-timed nuclear detonation, visible from Earth, would serve as a psychological show of dominance. Look at our space nuke, it would silently scream. We own the night sky. It was never about strategy. It was about vibes. Luckily for the moon, and for future tourism, saner minds prevailed. Scientists quietly shelved the project, likely after realizing that dusting lunar soil with fallout wasn't a great PR move. Plus, it might have, altered tides or atmospheres or reality itself. Still, the blueprint existed. And while America didn't nuke the moon, it did build some very real men to operate behind enemy lines like ghosts in the jungle. Merrill's Marauders, the original behind enemy lines badasses. Before there were Navy SEALs, before there were Delta Force commandos or drone operators sipping lattes from 40,000 feet, there were Merrill's Marauders, a group of volunteers who looked death in the eye, shrugged, and kept marching. Officially named the 5,307th Composite Unit, provisional, but known far more poetically by the name of their commander, Frank Merrill. These men operated deep behind Japanese lines in the steaming jungles of Burma during World War II. They walked over 1,000 miles, carrying their gear, often without resupply, through disease-ridden terrain so inhospitable that even the trees seemed angry. Dysentery, malaria, and monsoons were constant companions. The enemy? Just one more thing trying to kill them. Their mission was sabotage, intelligence, disruption. The kind of dirty work no conventional army could pull off. They succeeded at tremendous cost, accomplishing what seemed impossible, while leaving behind a legacy so wild that Hollywood tried and failed to do it justice. Merrill's Marauders were the ghost stories told around campfires in every Special Forces training camp thereafter. And while they fought in shadows, another campaign back home was shining the spotlight on a different kind of warrior, one with a rivet gun and a red bandana. Rosie the Riveter, the biceps that beat fascism. She didn't fight on the beaches of Normandy or crawl through Pacific jungles, but make no mistake, Rosie the Riveter helped win World War II. She wasn't one woman, but millions. Housewives, waitresses, teachers, and students who traded aprons for tool belts and flooded the factories after the men left for war. For the first time on a massive scale, women were building ships, tanks, planes, entire war machines, with lipstick on their collars and grime on their cheeks. The propaganda posters showed a stylized, muscle-flexing Rosie with the slogan, "We can do it." But this wasn't just branding. Women were welding hulls, riveting steel, wiring engines, and they were fast, good, and efficient. The American industrial machine turned into a juggernaut, thanks in no small part to the sudden flood of skilled, underpaid, overworked labor from women who previously weren't allowed near the front gate. And after the war, most of them were told politely and firmly to go back home. The factories shut their gates. The posters came down, but the rivets remained. And while Rosie was turning wrenches on aircraft carriers, the Navy was assembling a fleet of tiny, angry boats that would fight like mosquitoes and sting just as hard. The Mosquito Fleet. Small boats, big attitude. When your enemy has towering battleships, endless supplies, and entire navies at their disposal, what do? If you're the U.S. Navy, you build the opposite. A ragtag fleet of tiny, fast, heavily armed boats and send them darting around like angry hornets. Enter the Mosquito Fleet, a collection of patrol torpedo, PT boats built for speed, surprise, and sheer audacity. These vessels weren't armored. They weren't intimidating, but they were nimble, and when packed with torpedoes and gutsy crews, they were deadly. Operating mostly in coastal waters during both world wars, PT boats could sneak in, strike hard, and vanish before the enemy even understood what was happening. Think of them as naval drive-by specialists with better aim and saltier language. John F. Kennedy famously commanded PT-109, which was sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer in 1943. He survived, swam for miles, and turned the story into political gold. But most crews didn't make the history books. They just patrolled, ambushed, and lived fast. The Mosquito Fleet's bite was far worse than its buzz. And while the boats may have been small, their explosions, and the things they carried, certainly were not. Which brings us to some famously chubby nuclear children, Little Boy and Fat Man. The nicknames of the apocalypse. It's easy to forget that the first two nuclear weapons ever used in combat, Little Boy and Fat Man, were named with the same casual flippancy usually reserved for pet goldfish or mafia enforcers. But these weren't nicknames for fun. They were ironic, darkly humorous titles attached to the deadliest weapons ever created. Little Boy, dropped on Hiroshima, was a long, skinny uranium bomb, hence the name. Fat Man, which obliterated Nagasaki, was shorter and rounder, a plutonium implosion device that delivered even more devastating results. Together, they ended a war and began a century of nuclear anxiety. And they did it under names that sounded like rejected cartoon characters. But the design differences weren't just aesthetic. Little Boy used a simpler gun-type detonation, while Fat Man's implosion mechanism was far more complex and deadly efficient. The names made them sound like comic relief. Their impact made them nightmares written in fire. Their legacy? Mushroom clouds, global fear, and a permanent seat at the table of human regret. And while nuclear fire was falling from the sky, back on the home front, the U.S. military was busy experimenting with far less dramatic, but equally strange, airborne reconnaissance involving pigeons with cameras. Spy pigeons, feathers, film, and flight plans. You read that right. Before satellites, spy drones, or Google Earth, the U.S. military tried using pigeons strapped with tiny cameras to photograph enemy territory from above. It sounds like the fever dream of a bird-obsessed surveillance enthusiast, but it actually happened. For a brief moment in the early 20th century, pigeons became America's winged paparazzi. These avian spies were fitted with lightweight automatic cameras attached to tiny harnesses. The idea was simple. Release the bird, let it fly over enemy territory, and hope it returned with photos that weren't just blurry images of rooftops and confused cows. And sometimes it worked. The pigeons were fast, inconspicuous, and immune to radar, all things the U-2 spy plane could only dream of. But the method wasn't exactly foolproof. Training pigeons to fly specific paths over enemy targets was more art than science. Sometimes they didn't come back. Sometimes they took pictures of trees. Sometimes enemy soldiers just looked up, saw a flying camera, and shot it down. Still, for a hot minute, they were the stealth tech of their time. Because when you're fighting a world war, even your local park pigeons might have security clearance. The B-2 Spirit, the ghost bird of war. If Batman designed a bomber, it would be the B-2 Spirit, a sleek, jet-black wedge of death that looks more like a UFO than a piece of military hardware. But make no mistake, this thing doesn't just look alien, it practically vanishes from radar. Its radar cross-section, reportedly about the size of a seagull. A 160,000-pound flying wing that masquerades as poultry. That's stealth. The B-2 wasn't just expensive, it was absurdly expensive. By the time you added up R&D, each one cost around $2 billion. That's right, billion, with a B. And how many were made? 21. Because if you're going to build something that defies physics and national budgets, you keep the production run boutique. Its stealth technology allows it to fly into contested airspace, drop nuclear or conventional bombs, and fly right back out before anyone even knows what ruined their radar screen. But it's not all glamour and ghost mode. Maintaining it is a logistical nightmare. You don't just park a B-2, you pamper it. Still, it's a modern myth in matte black. And while it could sneak past missiles, one thing it couldn't sneak past: military dress codes. Which brings us to some inked-up controversy. Navy tattoos. From forbidden to fashionable, once upon a time, if you wanted to be a sailor and also rock a visible tattoo, you had to choose. The U.S. Navy for decades had strict policies about visible ink. If that anchor, skull, or regretful X's name peeked out of your dress whites, you were likely to get a hard pass from Uncle Sam. This, of course, was wildly ironic. Sailors practically invented American tattoo culture. Back in the early 20th century, naval tattoos were more than decoration. They were identity. An eagle meant patriotism. A ship meant you'd crossed the equator. A fully inked arm meant you probably had stories involving rum, knives, and at least one fight with a wall. But come inspection time, that meaningful body art could cost you your shot at a commission or promotion. Eventually, the Navy relaxed its rules, partly due to recruitment issues, partly because by the 2000s, half the country had ink anyway. Now, visible tattoos are fair game, as long as they're not offensive, gang-related, or really poorly done. Okay, maybe not the last one. So yes, today's sailors can honor tradition and rock a sleeve. And speaking of ominous sleeves, let's check the one holding the world's most ominous timepiece. The Doomsday Clock, humanity's existential wristwatch. Imagine if someone built a clock not to tell time, but to tell you how close you are to total annihilation. That's the Doomsday Clock, the world's most melodramatic wall decoration, and probably the only timepiece that ticks toward oblivion. Maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists since 1947, it doesn't count seconds or hours. It counts existential dread. Originally focused on nuclear war, the clock now includes climate change, biotechnology, cyber threats, and anything else that could usher in the end of civilization between breakfast and lunch. Midnight represents global catastrophe. Every year, a group of very serious people with PhDs decide how many metaphorical minutes or seconds remain before the world as we know it goes poof. The closest it's ever been? Just 90 seconds to midnight. Because clearly we're thriving. And here's the kicker. It's not even a real clock. It's a metaphor. A haunting, symbolic calendar of impending doom that occasionally gets wheeled out in press conferences to remind humanity that it's not doing great. But hey, while scientists tracked our approach to the abyss, there's one military unit that kept time by marching in precise ceremony, 365 days a year, rain or shine, in absolute silence. The Old Guard, sentinels of stone and silence. While most military units train to fight wars, the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, better known as the Old Guard, trains to walk in absolute silence, with spine-straight posture, stone-faced expressions, and a cadence so precise it makes metronomes feel insecure. As the Army's oldest active-duty regiment, they're not just ceremonial, they're sacred. These are the men and women who guard the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, in full dress uniform, regardless of weather, politics, or global collapse. To earn that role, soldiers endure some of the most grueling training imaginable, not to fight, but to perfect the art of stillness, dignity, and ritual. They memorize the names and burial locations of fallen comrades. They spend hours getting every thread of their uniform just right. And once on duty, they walk 21 steps in one direction, pause for 21 seconds, then walk 21 steps back, over and over, in honor of the 21-gun salute. They don't flinch. They don't speak. They don't break formation even during hurricanes. While others deploy with rifles, the Old Guard deploys with reverence. And it's their job to make sure we never forget. Now contrast that solemn legacy with, well, the humble shelf-stable lasagna packet known as the MRE. MREs, meals, regrets, and endless shelf life. The MRE, meal, ready to eat, is the culinary equivalent of a dare wrapped in olive drab plastic. Designed to survive for 5 years without refrigeration and withstand all the emotional trauma of battlefield logistics, the MRE is both sustenance and science experiment. Soldiers call them meals rarely edible, and with good reason. You haven't really lived until you've tried to eat rehydrated chili mac in a foxhole. Introduced in the 1980s as a modern alternative to old-school sea rations, MREs come in vacuum-sealed pouches complete with entree, sides, condiments, and a flameless chemical heater that smells like regret and sulfur. One bag might include beef stew, peanut butter, and a pound cake. Another, tuna and crackers with a side of existential despair. They are simultaneously despised and revered, hated for their taste, but loved for their reliability. Soldiers trade them like currency, hoard the good ones, spaghetti, and burn the cursed ones, omelet with veggies. Yet they've fueled everything from combat missions to disaster zones. In short, MREs prove one thing. When civilization collapses, you may be hungry, but you won't starve. And speaking of unexpected things happening under stadiums and squash courts, the first nuclear chain reaction happened under a football stadium. It sounds like something out of a conspiracy thriller. Beneath a University of Chicago football stadium, inside a squash court no less, scientists quietly conducted the first ever self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. No warning signs, no big announcement. Just Enrico Fermi and a group of researchers, messing with atomic energy underneath bleachers where frat boys once tailgated. The year was 1942, and this was part of the secretive Manhattan Project. The site was called Chicago Pile 1, a massive stack of graphite blocks and uranium fuel arranged like some kind of demonic Lego project. There was no reactor building, no containment dome, just a bunch of geniuses in lab coats flipping switches and praying the math was right. Spoiler, it was. The chain reaction was controlled, sustained, and successful. A scientific milestone that quietly rewrote the rules of existence. No explosion, no meltdown, just an eerie humming triumph beneath a stadium no one realized was now history's most radioactive athletic venue. They finished the experiment, shook hands, and then casually invented the atomic age while under the bleachers. And if you thought that was weird, wait until you see what the Navy was painting on their ships to win the next war. Dazzle camouflage, the Navy's floating optical illusions. During both World Wars, the U.S. Navy faced a problem. How do you hide a 600-foot-long ship from a submarine? The answer, apparently, was not to hide at all, but to confuse the living hell out of the enemy with paint. Enter Dazzle camouflage, a surrealist fever dream painted onto warships to distort their shapes, disrupt depth perception, and make German U-boat captains squint harder than ever before. These designs weren't your standard military olive drab. They were angular, high-contrast, asymmetrical patterns. Black and white stripes, jagged curves, optical illusions worthy of an opium den. The goal wasn't invisibility, it was deception. By confusing the observer about the ship's speed, direction, and even size, it made it harder to fire torpedoes accurately. Did it work? Sort of. Results were mixed, but it was better than nothing, and it certainly gave sailors something to brag about. Their ships didn't just float, they performed. War, it turns out, can be fought with paintbrushes and abstraction. And while these ships zigzagged across oceans dressed like Picasso's nightmares, another terrifying abstraction was taking shape in strategy rooms back home. A doctrine built entirely around the assumption that everyone dies. Mutually assured destruction. Welcome to the apocalypse plan. Imagine building a global defense policy on the premise that if you die, everyone dies. That's the cheerful logic behind mutually assured destruction, or, as the military calls it, MAD, because subtlety is for civilians. The concept emerged during the Cold War when both the United States and the Soviet Union realized they had enough nuclear weapons to end human civilization. Multiple times. So instead of reducing arsenals, they made a deal with doom. The idea is grotesquely elegant. If one side launches, the other retaliates, instantly, automatically, and without mercy. The result? Everyone loses. Total annihilation. The logic was that this horror show balance would prevent either side from ever firing first. A kind of apocalyptic Mexican standoff, with thermonuclear pistols. To make this nightmare credible, both nations built elaborate systems to guarantee a retaliatory strike, even if their capitals were vaporized. Submarines with launch codes, missiles in silos, bombers on standby, all of it humming in the background of daily life like a distant thunderstorm no one wanted to talk about. It was terrifying. It was effective. And somehow, it worked. The world didn't end. Meanwhile, while nukes loomed above, American soldiers on the ground were putting their faith in something a little furrier. Bomb-sniffing dogs. Heroes with tails and noses. Long before robots rolled around with bomb-diffusing arms and soulless camera eyes, the U.S. military turned to man's oldest battlefield companion, the dog. But this time, instead of chasing intruders or guarding tents, these four-legged heroes were trained to do something extraordinary. Sniff out explosives buried in the ground, hidden in buildings, or tucked away in abandoned vehicles. Dogs have noses so sensitive they can detect trace amounts of chemicals with terrifying accuracy. So naturally, the military trained them to recognize the scent of landmines, IEDs, and booby traps. The process wasn't simple. It involved months of conditioning, praise, treats, and trust. Because these dogs weren't just tools. They were teammates. Soldiers formed deep bonds with their canine partners. They slept beside them, ate with them, and followed their cues like gospel. In many cases, those dogs saved entire squads by signaling a hidden explosive just seconds before disaster. They wore vests, not capes. But they were heroes all the same. And while these dogs were outsmarting death with their noses, somewhere deep in a bunker, codebreakers were trying to do the same thing, with keyboards, logic, and one very famous enemy machine, the Enigma machine. When the Germans forgot to unplug their secrets, the Enigma machine was the German military's pride and joy. A mechanical cipher device that churned out encrypted messages like a bureaucratic fever dream. Every day the code changed. Every message had a different key. It was, in theory, uncrackable. The Nazis thought it was the crown jewel of secure communication. Enter Allied codebreakers and the world's first true nerd war. While the British effort at Bletchley Park often steals the spotlight, thanks Hollywood, the United States had its own share of code-breaking warriors working furiously to intercept and decode the Axis secrets. Enigma wasn't just a cryptographic puzzle. It was a race against time. Every message cracked meant potential ships saved, lives spared, or ambushes avoided. The real star of this intellectual knife fight? Alan Turing, whose work built the foundation for modern computing, while simultaneously ensuring Nazis died confused and disorganized. His machine, the bomb, could run through millions of possible Enigma settings in a fraction of the time a human could. It didn't win the war alone, but it sure helped. So the Germans had Enigma. The Allies had math and tenacity. And while that war was waged with gears and gears alone, the next naval marvel was born not from cryptography, but from coal, USS Langley. The first American aircraft carrier was a coal ship in disguise. Before sleek supercarriers ruled the seas, the United States Navy decided to test a radical concept. What if you took a coal transport ship and glued a runway on top? Thus, in 1920, the USS Langley was born. A converted collier turned into the Navy's first aircraft carrier. It wasn't fast, it wasn't glamorous, but it could launch planes, most of the time. And in those early days, that was enough. The Langley looked like someone had bolted a barn roof onto a barge, and in many ways, that's exactly what it was. Its deck was flat, narrow, and unforgiving. Pilots practicing takeoffs and landings often found themselves either in the drink or entangled in the safety nets. But it was the first, and that made it legendary. Its real mission wasn't combat, it was experimentation. How to launch, land, store, refuel, and coordinate aircraft from sea. The ship became a floating lab for the Navy's flying ambitions, a testing ground that paved the way for generations of carriers to come. Eventually, Langley was relegated to duty as a seaplane tender and later sunk in World War II. But it earned its place in history as the awkward, noisy forefather of modern naval aviation. And while America was launching planes from coal haulers, it was also planning something much colder and far more apocalyptic beneath the ice. Project Iceworm. Nuclear missiles beneath Greenland. In the depths of the Cold War, when the U.S. and Soviet Union were playing a daily game of nuclear poker, someone at the Pentagon proposed the kind of plan that starts with "hear me out" and ends with "we'll just bury them under the ice." That plan was Project Iceworm, a top-secret proposal to install mobile nuclear missile launch sites under Greenland's ice sheet. Yes, mobile, under the ice. Because what could possibly go wrong? The idea was to dig a sprawling network of tunnels beneath the surface, a frozen city, really, that could house dozens of medium-range ballistic missiles. These missiles could then be moved around to confuse Soviet tracking systems, making a first strike nearly impossible to prevent. The project even got a cover name, Camp Century. Because nothing says peaceful research base like a subterranean doomsday grid. The military actually started digging. They built tunnels, labs, even a tiny nuclear power plant. But they hadn't accounted for one small detail. Ice moves, slowly but relentlessly. The tunnels warped, cracked, and collapsed. The entire project was quietly abandoned, and the site was left buried like a snow-covered secret. But hey, while nukes sank under ice, another American weapon quietly took to the stars, ready to pick a fight. America's first combat in space. Satellite versus satellite, sort of. In the long list of things that sound fake but aren't, here's a good one. The first American combat action in space wasn't a dogfight between astronauts or a laser showdown over Mars. It was a satellite intercept. During the Cold War, the U.S. military quietly tested anti-satellite technology designed to disable or destroy enemy space assets. This wasn't science fiction. It was orbital chess with very real stakes. While the details remained fogged in government smog, the basic idea was clear. America launched a satellite, maneuvered it close to a Soviet satellite, and interacted in a way that probably involved exploding parts or at the very least a dramatic systems failure. It wasn't quite war in space, but it also wasn't a friendly wave across the void. These tests revealed just how fragile and vulnerable satellites were, and how important. Space was no longer just for stargazing or sending beeping metal balls into orbit. It was a battlefield of eyes, ears, and long-range triggers. So while the general public was looking at the moon and dreaming of flags and footprints, military planners were quietly preparing for orbital sabotage. But if you thought that was the weirdest airborne messenger in U.S. history, let's go back down to Earth and talk pigeons. Again, homing pigeons behind enemy lines. You'd think by the Second World War, humans would have evolved past sending tiny feathered messengers into combat zones. But no, when the going got tough and the radios got jammed, the military got pigeons, again. And this time, they dropped them behind enemy lines. The plan was simple. Parachute in a cage of trained pigeons with resistance fighters or stranded units. Write a note. Tie it to a bird. Release. Wait. And if the pigeons were trained right and not eaten en route, the note would return to Allied headquarters with intel. Enemy positions, requests for supply drops, or simple status updates like, "We're alive. Please send chocolate." It worked more often than you'd expect. Pigeons were fast, quiet, and, crucially, didn't require batteries. They didn't care about terrain or weather. They just flew home. Of course, enemy forces figured this out too and tried intercepting them. Some even trained falcons to hunt them down. Aerial combat, but for birds. Welcome to the weirdest subplot of World War II. And just when you think weaponized wildlife can't get any more insane, here comes a glorious piece of artillery that didn't just go boom. It went nuclear. The atomic cannon. Because regular shells just weren't enough. In the 1950s, America built a cannon so absurdly over the top, it makes steampunk anime look restrained. Officially called the M65, but more affectionately and ominously known as Atomic Annie, this massive artillery piece could fire a nuclear shell over 20 miles. Let that sink in. A battlefield cannon that launched miniature nukes. It was enormous. Over 80 tons of steel and ambition. It had to be transported by 2 separate trucks. Like some divorced mega-weapon trying to make it work for the kids. And when it fired its first and only test shot in 1953, the resulting explosion lit up the Nevada desert and probably a few generals' careers. The atomic cannon was part of that short-lived era where the U.S. thought everything should be nuclear. Bombs, subs, power plants, even handheld grenades. Yes, really. But while impressive, the M65 was also deeply impractical. It was slow, hard to deploy, and by the time it arrived at the battlefield, the war would likely be over, or escalated into global doom. So the cannon retired, having proven a point. America could fire nukes from the back of a truck. Next up, the Navy proves once again that ceremony and absurdity are not mutually exclusive. Crossing the line. The Navy's equatorial initiation ritual. There are few rites of passage in the U.S. Navy more bizarre, or enduring, than the crossing the line ceremony. If you're a sailor who has never crossed the equator by sea, you are a lowly pollywog. Cross it for the first time, and you're subjected to a hazing ritual so elaborate it makes college fraternities look like quiet book clubs. Survive, and you earn your title as a shellback, a sailor reborn by Neptune himself, sort of. This isn't your standard award ceremony. It's a full-blown day of naval theater, with sailors dressing as mythical sea gods, pirates, and questionable aquatic creatures. Pollywogs are paraded around, covered in mystery substances. Think old food, soap, or worse. Forced to crawl through garbage, kiss greasy bellies dubbed the royal baby, and confess imaginary crimes to King Neptune and his court. Dignity? Leave it in port. It's gross. It's absurd. It's Navy tradition. And surprisingly, it builds camaraderie. Sailors who survive it share a lifelong badge of honor and a bunch of very strange photographs. Once upon a time, even in the depths of war, there was always room for spectacle. But for the Army, spectacle came in the form of a much deadlier evolution. The rise of guided missiles. Guided missiles. From German vengeance to American vengeance 2.0. It's a strange fact of history that the U.S. Army's first operational guided missile came from the same blueprints that once targeted London with vengeance. The V-2 rocket, developed by Nazi Germany as a terrifyingly advanced weapon of war, was captured, studied, and of course, reverse-engineered by American military minds eager to turn enemy horror into national asset. After World War II, Operation Paperclip quietly whisked German scientists, including Werner von Braun, to the U.S. Not to face justice, but to design next-gen rockets. Morality took a coffee break while the arms race heated up. The result? The V-2 technology paved the way for American guided missile programs. Weapons that could travel further, faster, and with terrifying accuracy. No more guessing. No more arcs of doom. Just set a target and let physics handle the rest. And yes, it was effective, but it also marked the start of a new kind of warfare. One where humans no longer had to see the battlefield or the people they were destroying. War by remote control. And speaking of remote, decentralized operations, the Manhattan Project wasn't just one desert test site. It was a nationwide conspiracy of uranium and silence. The Manhattan Project was everywhere, not just the desert. Everyone knows about Los Alamos, New Mexico, the dusty lab where physicists split atoms and moral hairs. But what most don't realize is that the Manhattan Project was less a place and more a secret national shadow network. It had branches, like a really quiet franchise of destruction. Oak Ridge, Tennessee handled uranium enrichment. Hanford, Washington specialized in plutonium production. Chicago, as we've already seen, hosted the first controlled chain reaction under a stadium. And dozens of smaller sites helped process, ship, and assemble components for a bomb no one outside their departments even knew existed. Thousands of workers toiled under code names and cover stories. Just building parts, they'd say. For something. Many didn't know they were making pieces of the most dangerous weapon ever conceived until after Hiroshima. Imagine finding out your summer job contributed to the dawn of the nuclear age. This decentralized approach was a masterclass in secrecy and logistics. America didn't just build the bomb. It built an invisible infrastructure of science, industry, and denial to deliver it. And even after all that effort, some folks still thought, you know what this needs? A wooden flight deck. Let's talk about questionable naval architecture. Wooden flight decks. The Navy's not-so-fireproof brainstorm. In the grand tradition of sounds good on paper, The U.S. Navy once considered building aircraft carriers with wooden flight decks. This wasn't during the age of the muskets and cannonballs. This was well into the era of mechanized warfare. Yes, while the rest of the world was upgrading to steel and armor plating, some bright minds said, "What if lumber?" Now, to be fair, wood was lighter, cheaper, and readily available. In theory, it made sense for speedier builds and easier repairs. But there was one glaring problem: wood burns. And when your flight deck is a runway for fuel-laden aircraft in a theater of war, you don't exactly want the surface to double as kindling. Sure enough, during kamikaze attacks in the Pacific, carriers with wooden decks suffered horrific fires and explosions. Flames spread faster. Damage control became a nightmare. Lesson learned. Steel decks became standard, heavy, yes, but not instantly flammable. This experiment in naval cost-cutting proves one thing. Just because you can build a runway out of tree bark doesn't mean you should. Meanwhile, while the Navy was sorting out its building materials, the Army was getting creative with naming conventions, including one little vehicle with a big identity crisis: Jeep. From GP to global icon, the Jeep didn't start as a brand. It started as a military acronym that stumbled into pop culture greatness. Officially, it came from GP, short for General Purpose Vehicle. But say GP out loud a few times and you'll see where it's going. GP, Jeep. And just like that, the name stuck. The troops coined it. The brass accepted it. And eventually, so did your suburban dad. The original World War II Jeep was a squat, rugged, bare-bones chunk of steel designed to go anywhere, carry anything, and break down only when it was least convenient. It could ford streams, climb hills, and outrun some tanks in reverse. It was the Swiss Army knife of military vehicles, and soldiers loved it. They gave it nicknames, drew pin-up girls on the hood, and even used it as field ambulances, gun platforms, or makeshift parade floats. Post-war, the Jeep transitioned from battlefield mule to civilian toy. Now it's sold with heated seats and Bluetooth. But it all traces back to a time when comfort was defined as not currently being shot at. And while the Jeep rolled across battlefields, another experiment was underway. One with bigger ambitions, fewer wheels, and a giant gun pointed at space. Project HARP, shooting things into space with a giant cannon. Long before Elon Musk started launching cars into orbit, the U.S. military tried something far more primal. Fire things into space with a really, really big gun. That's not hyperbole. Project HARP, the High Altitude Research Project, was a Cold War effort to lob projectiles into the upper atmosphere using an enormous artillery cannon. No rockets, no engines, just raw Newtonian violence. The supergun was a monstrous 16-inch cannon bolted together from naval gun barrels and pointed skyward, like it had a personal grudge against the stratosphere. The idea was simple. If you could fire something fast enough, it might just break through Earth's atmosphere. And it worked. Kind of. Test projectiles reached altitudes of over 100 kilometers. Technically space, but getting a payload back down in one piece? Less successful. HARP's promise was cheap space access without rockets. But the project never got beyond the test phase. Budget cuts, changing priorities, and the general realization that launching satellites with artillery might be a bit much led to its quiet cancellation. Still, it was one hell of a shot, and speaking of early awkward steps into new military territory, let's talk about America's very first official submarine. It didn't go far, but it definitely went down in history. The Holland 6, America's first official submarine purchase. Before submarines became sleek, nuclear-powered juggernauts, they were essentially floating steel cigars with a prayer stuffed inside. The Holland 6, purchased by the U.S. Navy in 1900, was the first official submarine commissioned into American service. A bizarre, gas-powered, hand-steered prototype that looked more like a failed steampunk art project than a weapon of war. But it worked. Kind of. Designed by Irish engineer John Philip Holland, This awkward aquatic contraption could submerge, fire a torpedo, and, crucially, resurface without immediately imploding. A modest bar, but a vital one. The Navy was skeptical at first, because of course they were. Submarines at the time were generally viewed as either scientific novelties or underwater coffins. The Holland V6 had to prove it wasn't both. And it did. After a series of tests and a few very wet misfires, the Navy finally accepted the submarine, renamed it USS Holland SS-1, and set the stage for over a century of underwater warfare. It wasn't fast. It wasn't roomy. It reeked of oil and anxiety. But it worked, and that was enough. From that humble steel fish came an entire lineage of vessels that would one day carry ballistic missiles. And if you thought the Navy was the only branch getting experimental, wait until you see what the Army Signal Corps was up to with wires, waves, and wartime photography. The Signal Corps, where radio waves and war collided. Long before we had encrypted messaging apps and satellites whispering secrets across the globe, we had the U.S. Army Signal Corps, a group of technicians, engineers, and deeply patient men with wires wrapped around their legs, trying to get a message through before everything exploded. Formed in 1860 and active in every American conflict since, the Signal Corps didn't fire the guns. They made sure the people who had the guns knew where to point them. They laid cables through swamps, built radio towers and bomb craters, and developed early photographic reconnaissance during World War I, turning war into something you could develop in a darkroom. But they weren't just battlefield errand boys. The Signal Corps helped pioneer American radio. Their experiments laid the groundwork for everything from walkie-talkies to satellite comms. They turned war into a communication network, noisy, frantic, and absolutely essential. They didn't get the glory. They got static, voltage burns, and trench foot. But without them, the battlefield would have been a lot quieter and a lot bloodier. And while they were setting up wires, the Navy was prepping for something louder, faster, and way more airborne. A flight squadron with a need for speed and matching sunglasses. The Blue Angels, death-defying ballet at Mach speed. If you've ever seen a group of jet fighters rip across the sky in perfect formation, screaming past at barely subsonic speeds, chances are you've witnessed the U.S. Navy's Blue Angels, formed in 1946 as a way to boost morale and show off some post-war muscle. This elite flight demonstration team took the art of military aviation and turned it into a very loud, very dangerous form of performance art. Originally flying Hellcats, then Skyhawks, and eventually the now iconic FA-18 Super Hornets, the Blue Angels don't just fly, they choreograph. At 700 miles per hour, they fly so close together they could pass each other salt packets. The margin for error? Less than your lunch tray. These aren't stunt pilots. They're active-duty naval aviators pulled from combat roles and retrained to dance in the sky with afterburners. They fly 18 inches apart, upside down, sideways, inverted, and sometimes all of the above at once. And they make it look easy. Every show is part spectacle, part recruitment tool, part gravity-defying therapy session for America's collective military pride. And while they rule the skies, underwater, things were getting strange again, especially when the military realized the trained sea creatures might be better divers than their human operators. Trained SEALs, underwater agents, with flippers and a mission. If you thought dolphins were the only sea creatures recruited by the military, let us introduce you to their equally slippery, slightly sassier cousins, trained SEALs. That's right. The U.S. military, always in search of the weirdest way to win a war, decided to teach these semi-aquatic acrobats how to find underwater objects, locate lost equipment, and even detect enemy divers. Unlike dolphins, SEALs rely on their incredible eyesight rather than sonar. That made them ideal for visual tasks in murky waters, like spotting foreign objects that didn't belong on the ocean floor. And because seals are naturally curious, trainable, and strangely eager for fishy rewards, the Navy quickly found them useful as mobile, aquatic search engines. In controlled trials, they were often faster than divers and more reliable than machines. No batteries to charge, no oxygen tanks to refill. Just one seal, a harness, and an unnerving talent for underwater precision. Of course, the ethical implications are complicated. But from a purely tactical standpoint, seals proved to be excellent team players, as long as you didn't run out of snacks. And while those marine mammals were scouring the depths above ground, something blinding and history-altering had just cracked open the atomic age. The Trinity test, a flash of boom, and the end of innocence. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the U.S. detonated the first atomic bomb, an experiment codenamed Trinity. It was the kind of moment that splits history in half. A silent countdown, a humming device made of theoretical physics and uranium nightmares. And then, a flash so bright it turned night into day. The light could be seen hundreds of miles away. The shockwave broke windows, rattled bones, and cracked open the era of nuclear fear. Some scientists watched in awe, others in horror. One quoted the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." There's something chilling about scientists who spend years crunching numbers suddenly realizing they've built a sun on Earth. A temporary one, thankfully. But still, Trinity wasn't just a test. It was proof of concept and a warning. And once that genie exploded out of its bomb casing, there was no stuffing it back in. Hiroshima and Nagasaki came weeks later. The world changed forever, and everyone knew it. But for one quiet branch of the Navy, change was less about big bangs and more about silence. Deep, methodical, untraceable silence beneath the waves. The Silent Service. Submariners who don't like surface attention. The U.S. Navy submarine force doesn't just hide beneath the sea. It hides from the spotlight, too. Known as the Silent Service, these sailors operate in a realm of hushed radio transmissions, sonar pings, and missions so classified, most crew members can't even tell their families what ocean they're floating under. It's not just a nickname, it's a lifestyle. These subs disappear for months at a time. No ports, no sunlight, no breaks. Just 150 sailors sealed in a steel tube with nuclear reactors, cruise missiles, and zero margin for error. Their job? Everything from reconnaissance to nuclear deterrence. In peacetime, they vanish. In wartime, they're the thing you never see coming. The conditions are brutal. Bunks stacked like coffins. Air thick with recycled breath. Food that gets progressively stranger the longer the patrol drags on. And yet, morale runs high. Partly because silence, it turns out, bonds people. The Silent Service rarely gets medals or headlines. But they're always there, lurking, watching, waiting. And while they operate in the shadows, other military experiments were trying to fly dogs into enemy territory by strapping parachutes on them. Yes, really, parachuting dogs, the Army's furriest paratroopers. If you thought humans were the only ones jumping out of planes during World War II, think again. In one of history's more baffling combinations of courage and chaos, the U.S. Army tried training dogs to parachute into combat zones. Yes, actual parachuting dogs. Imagine Fido, ears flapping in the wind, floating down into Nazi territory with a harness, a mission, and absolutely no understanding of what was happening. The logic, at least on paper, made sense. Dogs were already used for reconnaissance, detection, and message delivery. Dropping them in behind enemy lines could, in theory, get them where they were needed fast. But theory met reality when it turned out that most dogs, understandably, didn't enjoy being shoved out of aircraft. Some froze mid-air. Others panicked in training. Many simply refused to jump, choosing instead to bite the nearest handler. A few dogs completed jumps successfully and were deployed in limited roles. But overall, the project proved more aspirational than operational. Turns out, strapping a terrified German Shepherd to a parachute and pushing it out of a C-47 isn't the best use of military resources. Still, the attempt says a lot about wartime desperation and canine loyalty. And speaking of disaster narrowly avoided, Apollo 13, a successful failure that nearly ended in disaster. Houston, we've had a problem. With those calm, ominous words, Apollo 13, NASA's third moonbound mission, became a spaceflight horror story that didn't end in tragedy, but came dangerously close. What was supposed to be a straightforward lunar landing turned into a real-time rescue mission when an oxygen tank exploded en route to the moon, crippling the spacecraft and leaving 3 astronauts stranded in a flying tin can 200,000 miles from Earth. Engineers back on the ground scrambled to create solutions using only the equipment the crew had on board. No simulations, no time. Just duct tape, slide rules, and sheer Apollo-era grit. The astronauts powered down non-essential systems, used the lunar module as a lifeboat, and improvised a carbon dioxide filter using cardboard and socks. Against all odds, Apollo 13 slingshotted around the moon and made it safely back home. The mission failed to land, yes, but it succeeded in proving that human ingenuity could overcome terrifying odds, even in the void of space. The public called it a miracle. NASA called it a successful failure. And speaking of slogans with a little Latin flair, let's check in on the Navy's official motto and the ethos baked into every sailor's bones. Non sibi sed patriae, not for self, but for country. It's Latin, it's succinct, and it's quietly intense. Non sibi sed patriae, not for self, but for country. This is the official motto of the U.S. Navy, and if it sounds like something you'd carve into marble, it's because it basically is. It's not shouted. It's not spray-painted on carrier decks. It's whispered into the psyche of every sailor, baked into the institutional DNA. The phrase dates back to Rome, of course, but the Navy's adoption of it adds a certain gravitas to the otherwise chaotic life of saltwater service. It encapsulates sacrifice, duty, and the idea that individual ambition gets left at the shoreline. Once you're aboard, you're part of something bigger. A floating civilization with orders, oaths, and a very strict chain of command. The motto shows up on plaques at funerals and etched into memorials, reminding everyone that the job isn't about glory or gain. It's about service, inconvenient, dangerous, and often thankless. And that stoic commitment? It was present even in the Civil War, where one general took to the skies, not in a plane, but in a balloon. Because sometimes duty looks like floating above a battlefield with a spyglass and an inflated sense of altitude. Fitzjohn Porter, the first general to balloon into battle. In 1862, during the American Civil War, a time when warfare still involved sabers and sideburns, Union Brigadier General Fitzjohn Porter became the first American military commander to ascend in a hot air balloon during combat. His mission? Aerial reconnaissance. His risk? Floating gently over a battlefield in what was essentially a flying wicker basket powered by fire. From high above the Virginia countryside, Porter peered through a telescope and relayed troop movements to his fellow commanders via telegraph lines tethered to the balloon. That's right. They had a floating general wired into the battlefield like some steampunk surveillance drone. But while the balloon provided a valuable bird's-eye view, it also made Porter an easy, slow-moving target. Confederate troops quickly realized there was a literal general hovering overhead, like a gift-wrapped prize, and opened fire. Luckily, balloons are unpredictable and wobbly, and the artillery missed. But the psychological impact? Significant. Though the balloon corps was short-lived due to logistical headaches and high-profile skepticism, Porter's ascent marked one of the earliest intersections of technology and warfare tactics. And speaking of high-tech oddities disguised as weather balloons, the military soon turned its ears to the sky. Not to listen to generals, but to eavesdrop on nuclear tests. Project Mogul. The Cold War's eavesdropping. Weather balloon. In the post-war scramble to keep tabs on the Soviet Union's growing nuclear ambitions, the U.S. launched Project Mogul, a top-secret effort to detect distant atomic explosions using high-altitude balloons that could ride the jet stream. These weren't your average party balloons. They were massive, complex arrays carrying acoustic sensors meant to float at 50,000 feet and pick up infrasonic waves from across the globe. The idea was that nuclear tests produce low-frequency sound waves that travel vast distances. By placing sensitive microphones into the upper atmosphere, the U.S. hoped to create an early warning system that could hear Soviet bomb tests from halfway around the world, like a planetary baby monitor for mushroom clouds. But here's where it gets weirder. One of these Project Mogul balloons crash-landed in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Cue the birth of every alien conspiracy theory ever. The military, scrambling to cover up the classified project, fumbled its explanation. Weather balloon, they said, which to no one's surprise convinced no one. Thus, Project Mogul entered both nuclear history and UFO mythology. A 2-for-1 special in Cold War confusion, and if you thought high-altitude listening devices were cutting edge, just wait till you meet the underwater weapon that changed naval warfare forever. The self-propelled torpedo, the Navy's deep-sea game-changer. Before torpedoes could propel themselves, they were essentially underwater cannonballs, dropped, shoved, or launched, with the hope that physics and optimism would take them where they needed to go. But in the 1860s, the U.S. Navy helped usher in a terrifying new standard, the self-propelled torpedo. A weapon that could think for itself. By Victorian standards, these early torpedoes were mechanical marvels. Compact cylinders filled with compressed air, propellers, and gyroscopes. Once launched from a ship or submarine, they could cruise underwater toward enemy vessels, maintaining direction and depth. And unlike cannonballs, they didn't rely on lucky angles or currents. They just moved. Relentlessly. Suddenly, naval combat wasn't about who had the bigger guns. It was about who could dodge an invisible, humming sea monster. Entire ship strategies had to be rewritten. Armor had to be reinforced. Sailors went to bed knowing that somewhere in the depths, a metal fish with explosives might be swimming their way. It was warfare evolved, not bigger, but smarter. And as the torpedoes zipped beneath the waves above the water, an elite binational unit was quietly carving out a reputation for nighttime raids and silent sabotage. The Devil's Brigade, U.S. Canadian commandos built for mayhem. Long before Joint Task Forces became trendy military lingo, the United States and Canada teamed up to form one of the most formidable and unsung Special Forces units of World War II. The 1st Special Service Force, better known, and more intimidatingly, as the Devil's Brigade. Think of it as a cross between a lumberjack bar fight and a commando raid, trained for cold weather, mountain warfare, and silent infiltration. Their job? Do the impossible, quietly, and then disappear. Formed in 1942, this binational force specialized in nighttime assaults, scaling cliffs, and making the enemy very, very uncomfortable. The Germans nicknamed them the Black Devils because they often struck under cover of darkness, their faces smeared in shoe polish, leaving calling cards that read, "The worst is yet to come." These weren't your average soldiers. They trained in hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, and skiing. Yes, skiing. Nothing says, "You're not in Kansas anymore," like being ambushed by stealthy commandos on snow-covered mountains. Despite their effectiveness, the Devil's Brigade was disbanded after the war. But their legacy lived on, influencing the formation of both U.S. Army Special Forces and Canada's elite units. And while they were slinking through forests and fjords back in Washington, another weapon of immense power was quietly following the president in a briefcase. The nuclear football. Apocalypse in a carry-on. It sounds like the plot to a political thriller. But the nuclear football is very real. A briefcase handcuffed to a military aide that follows the President of the United States everywhere. Inside, the keys to launching Armageddon. Not literally a red button, but the codes, options, and communication systems needed to order a nuclear strike from anywhere, at any time. No matter where the president goes. To a summit, a hospital, even a golf course. The football goes too, never more than a few feet away. It contains a secure communication link to the Pentagon and a booklet of nuclear war plans charmingly named The Biscuit. Because nothing says end-of-the-world decision-making like snack metaphors. The whole point is continuity. If Washington gets wiped out, the president still has the power to retaliate. And because the U.S. maintains a second strike policy, the assurance that it can and will respond to a nuclear attack, that football is more than a suitcase. It's a symbol of grim stability. And while that briefcase represents annihilation on demand, over in the Navy, someone was painting warships to look like optical puzzles, hoping that confusion might be the best kind of defense. Dazzle camouflage, again. When warships went full Picasso. Yes, this one deserves a double take, because the U.S. Navy didn't just flirt with Dazzle camouflage during World War I. They came back for seconds in World War II. And this time, the patterns were even weirder. The ships were bigger, and the seas were deadlier. The logic hadn't changed. Confuse the enemy. With submarines lurking below the surface, firing torpedoes based on estimated course and speed. A ship covered in sharp angles, clashing colors, and impossible shadows could throw off calculations just enough to survive. These weren't just paint jobs. They were optical warfare. Designs were often created by artists, literal painters, who had no military background but understood how the human eye could be fooled. The result? Warships that looked like floating cubist nightmares. Zigzags, spirals, swirls. Imagine a battleship designed by Escher while seasick. While the camouflage didn't make the ships invisible, it did succeed in sowing chaos, especially in split-second torpedo math. It was battlefield misdirection, stage magic on saltwater. So yes, the U.S. Navy once tried to outsmart torpedoes with art. And while the ships disguised themselves, the skies above were becoming a new battlefield. One where falcons were trained to take down drones. Falcon versus drone. The military's winged interceptors. In an age dominated by sleek drones and remote-controlled war machines, the U.S. military briefly turned to a much older form of air superiority. Birds of prey. Specifically, trained falcons. Because when electronics jam and radar gets spoofed, nothing beats talons and pure instinct. At one point, military researchers explored the idea of training falcons to intercept and attack enemy drones, particularly small surveillance-type UAVs that were hard to detect and even harder to hit with traditional weapons. The thinking was simple. Drones behave like birds, so maybe birds could take them down. Plus, falcons are fast, agile, and have been hunting airborne targets for centuries. In practice, it kind of worked. Falcons were trained to recognize and attack unfamiliar flying objects. They could knock drones out of the air with alarming precision. But there were complications. Falcons don't take orders like radar-guided missiles. Sometimes they missed. Sometimes they got bored. Sometimes they flew off entirely. You know, bird stuff.
In the end, the idea didn't become widespread, but it highlighted something fascinating. In a world of digital warfare, sometimes the best countermeasure has feathers and a bad attitude.
And while birds were hunting machines in the sky, two bombs, one fat, one skinny, were rewriting history with vastly different designs. Fat Man and Little Boy. Two bombs, two very different blueprints. If the atomic age had mascots, they'd be Fat Man and Little Boy. Two bombs that changed everything, each with its own unique personality. if you can call apocalyptic engine of destruction a personality. Despite their cartoonish names, their inner workings were anything but. Little Boy, dropped on Hiroshima, was a uranium-based gun-type device. The concept: fire one piece of uranium into another, fast enough to start a runaway chain reaction. It was simple, relatively speaking, and had never been tested before use. Bold move. Fat Man, used on Nagasaki, was the more advanced of the two. A plutonium-based implosion bomb. Instead of smashing atoms together like a pair of cymbals, it used carefully timed explosives to compress a plutonium core inward, triggering fission. Fat Man was tested first at Trinity. They didn't want surprises. The two bombs weren't just different in shape and mechanism. They symbolized the dual path of nuclear weapon development: brute force versus precision. Both were devastating. Both changed the world in seconds. And both have lived on in infamy. And while those atomic designs were flattening cities somewhere in the southwest desert, the Army was busy trying to move supplies the old-fashioned way, with camels. Again, the Camel Corps experiment, round 2 of Why Not Camels. In the mid-1800s, the American Southwest was a scorching, waterless mess. The Army needed a way to move supplies through terrain so unforgiving, even the mules were unionizing. And so someone, likely sun-drunk and desperate, had a thought. Camels. Let's try camels again. Yes, again. This wasn't the first time camels had been floated as military transport. But the U.S. Army officially launched the Camel Corps experiment, importing dozens of dromedaries from the Middle East, along with handlers who presumably had to explain that these weren't just weird-looking horses. The camels performed brilliantly. They carried massive loads, moved faster than mules, and needed far less water. Unfortunately, they also had attitudes. Big ones. They spit, kicked, bellowed, and refused to cooperate with the Army's more traditional animals, especially horses, who freaked out at the very sight of them. Despite their performance, camels never caught on. The Civil War broke out, priorities shifted, and the Army decided dealing with stubborn quadrupeds was not a wartime luxury they could afford. The remaining camels were auctioned off or released into the wild. Rumor has it, for years afterward, wild camels roamed the American desert, shaggy ghosts of a military experiment that should have worked, but didn't. USS Nautilus SSN 571, the submarine that ran on atoms. Launched in 1954, the USS Nautilus wasn't just a submarine, it was a prophecy fulfilled. For centuries, humans dreamed of vessels that could sail beneath the sea without surfacing for air, fuel, or a good excuse. The Nautilus finally delivered that dream by being the first operational nuclear-powered submarine. No more diesel engines, no more snorkeling, just pure, quiet, relentless nuclear power humming through the deep. The ship's namesake came straight from Jules Verne, and for once fiction didn't oversell it. The Nautilus could stay submerged for weeks at a time, limited more by the crew's patience than by the vessel's power supply. It didn't need to surface for fuel because its onboard reactor could keep the ship running for years. And it did. In 1958, Nautilus made history by crossing the North Pole under the Arctic ice cap. It was the ultimate power move during the Cold War. A stealthy underwater vessel gliding beneath enemy radar and frozen ocean alike. It didn't just redefine naval warfare. It redefined what submarines were. From that moment on, the future belonged to machines that didn't need to breathe. And while Nautilus was pioneering quiet dominance, the space race was heating up. And it wasn't just about science. The space race. More rocket envy than rocket science. Let's be honest, the space race wasn't purely about exploration, curiosity, or pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. It was about Cold War swagger. The United States and the Soviet Union weren't just launching rockets. They were launching flexes, one after another, each trying to prove who could dominate not just Earth, but the void above it. It started when the Soviets lobbed Sputnik into orbit in 1957. A shiny metal basketball that beeped just loudly enough to send American military planners into a panic. Suddenly, the skies were no longer friendly. They were potential missile corridors. Every satellite was a spy. Every launch was a threat. The U.S. scrambled to respond, pouring money into research, engineering, and PR. Space became the ultimate battleground of ideologies. Freedom versus communism, capitalism versus command economy, Tang versus borscht. But beneath all the patriotism and moon landings was a simple truth. Both sides wanted the high ground. NASA was born out of military need. Rockets that carried astronauts were kissing cousins to ICBMs. The line between science and war blurred until it was just vapor trails in the upper atmosphere. And while the skies became a chessboard down below, a school for dogfighting pilots was quietly rewriting the rules of air combat. Top Gun. Where Maverick was the homework. The United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known by its much cooler nickname, Top Gun, was founded in 1969 because, bluntly, American pilots were getting smoked in the skies over Vietnam. Turns out technology doesn't matter much when your pilots aren't trained to handle close-quarters dogfighting. So the Navy decided to fix that by building an elite training program focused entirely on air combat maneuvering. This wasn't classroom theory. This was a full-on aerial dojo. Instructors, known as the best of the best, without a hint of irony, flew aggressor aircraft, simulating enemy tactics so students could practice losing and then learning. It was intense, humiliating, and brutally effective. By the end of the program, pilots came out sharper, deadlier, and far more likely to come home. The curriculum emphasized discipline, situational awareness, and absolute mastery of flight. Not just the machines, but the instinct. The jet was a weapon, yes, but the pilot was the blade. Eventually, Hollywood got wind of it, turned it into a blockbuster, and made beach volleyball somehow essential to national defense. But the real Top Gun? It saved lives and changed air combat forever. And while pilots were being forged in sky duels, the Army was experimenting with something far more futuristic and far weirder. Think jetpacks, robots, and a few too many ideas from comic books. Project Agile, jetpacks, robots, and the Army's sci-fi side quest. In the 1960s, while the world was consumed by the Vietnam War and the Cold War was in full frostbite mode, the U.S. Army quietly embarked on something far stranger than geopolitics. Project Agile, a surreal blend of futurism, field testing, and Cold War ambition. It was like the military walked into a sci-fi convention and shouted, "We'll take one of everything." The project's goal was to explore exotic technologies that could give American forces the edge in counterinsurgency warfare. That meant remote-controlled reconnaissance robots, personal jetpacks, experimental sensors, and various other inventions that sounded cool until someone had to carry them through a jungle. Many of these technologies were so ahead of their time that they tripped over their own potential. The jetpacks, for instance, looked amazing, until you realized they only flew for 20 seconds and made you an extremely loud, slow-moving target. Still, Project Agile had its moments. Some sensor systems and night vision tools actually became the foundation for later military advancements. Others, buried in the archives like awkward high school science fair projects. And while Agile dreamed of robotic scouts and flying soldiers, another force was quietly ushering in a new era. One powered not by batteries or gunpowder, but by atoms. The atomic age begins. One detonation to rule them all. July 16, 1945, wasn't just the day of the Trinity test. It was the Big Bang of the atomic age. That first controlled nuclear explosion didn't just end an era of conventional warfare. It marked the beginning of a completely new philosophical and strategic reality. From that blinding white flash forward, every military and political decision had to answer one unspoken question. What happens if the nukes fly? The atomic age wasn't just about weaponry. It was about living under a permanent, low-humming threat. Fallout shelters became as normal as family sedans. Children learned to duck and cover. Governments drew up plans for post-apocalyptic civil defense, like it was just another part of urban planning. Civilization began to brace for a war it couldn't survive. But the atomic age also birthed breakthroughs: nuclear power, advanced medical treatments, and a new understanding of the universe's subatomic chaos. For better or worse, and mostly worse, humanity had opened a door it couldn't close. And while most of the military was focused on controlling atoms somewhere in a Pentagon backroom, someone looked at a killer whale and asked, could we weaponize that? Killer whales in the Cold War. The Navy's orca obsession. Yes, the Navy really considered using killer whales, actual orcas, as military assets during the Cold War. Because when you've already trained dolphins to find mines and sea lions to retrieve objects, the natural next step is to see what you can do with a 9,000-pound apex predator that can crush seals with its jaws. The idea? Use orcas for tasks like base defense, mine detection, or even underwater combat against enemy divers. Because nothing ruins your covert operation like an angry whale charging at you through the murk, black and white like a torpedo with teeth. The logic was bizarrely sound. Orcas are intelligent, trainable, and terrifying. Why not turn them into oceanic security guards? In practice, however, training them proved difficult. They weren't exactly eager to take orders, and unlike dolphins, they didn't respond well to confined spaces or routine military structure. And feeding them was a logistical nightmare. Turns out, apex predators are not budget-friendly, so the killer whale program never took off. But it's comforting, or horrifying, to know there's a classified document somewhere titled Initial Orca Capabilities Assessment. And while the oceans nearly became home to orca sentries back on dry land, something far less menacing was being born. A flag with stars, stripes, and revolutionary intentions. Stars and stripes. The revolutionary flag with a marketing problem. In 1777, in the middle of a war for independence, and while most of the colonies were still trying to figure out how governments actually worked, the Continental Congress paused and said, "You know what we need? A flag. A really good one." And so they adopted the stars and stripes. 13 alternating red and white bars with a circle of stars on a blue field, representing the original colonies. It was a powerful symbol, clean, bold, vaguely symmetrical, and easy enough to sew without a textile degree. It looked like unity, or at least something patriotic enough to wave while yelling about tea taxes. Of course, the flag didn't exactly take off immediately. The early republic was too busy surviving to organize parades or manufacture bunting. But over time, as the nation expanded and more stars were added, the flag morphed into something more than decoration. It became an emblem of identity, rebellion, victory, and, depending on the moment, a moral paradox wrapped in cloth. By the 20th century, it was everywhere. Stamped on helmets, planted on the moon, burned in protest, and raised in triumph. Not bad for a flag designed during a break between cannon volleys. Meanwhile, the Navy wasn't planting flags. It was testing out something even stranger. Aquatic donkeys, sea mules, naval cargo, hooved and amphibious. No, sea mule isn't a new type of cocktail. It was the U.S. Navy's honest attempt to solve one of its oldest logistical headaches: how to get heavy cargo from ships to shore without a pier or a proper road. The answer? Small amphibious vehicles, affectionately, or perhaps sarcastically, dubbed sea mules. These vehicles weren't glamorous. Picture a squat wheeled metal box on treads, designed to roll off landing craft, plow through surf, and drag crates, fuel drums, and other wartime debris across beaches under fire. They didn't move fast. They weren't subtle, but they worked, more or less. The mule part of the name came from their stubborn reliability. They didn't do anything fancy. They just hauled. And while they didn't receive much glory, they played a vital role in amphibious operations, especially during World War II and the early Cold War years. Eventually, better landing craft and helicopters made them obsolete. But for a brief moment in military history, the Sea Mule was the unsung hero of shoreline supply chains. And speaking of unsung but critical components, let's revisit a project that produced not just one, but 3 world-altering bombs, each with its own fiery footprint. The Manhattan Project's nuclear triplets: Trinity, Little Boy, Fat Man. Most people know the Manhattan Project gave us 2 deployed atomic bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man. But the full trio includes Trinity, the very first bomb ever detonated. Together, they represent the holy trinity of nuclear initiation: the test, the weapon, and the proof-of-concept nightmare. Trinity was the plutonium-based implosion device tested in New Mexico, a necessary rehearsal to make sure Fat Man wouldn't fizzle out and embarrass the nation mid-genocide. When Trinity went off, it created a blinding flash and a shockwave that broke windows miles away. The scientists called it beautiful, then immediately stopped smiling. Little Boy was the first actual wartime deployment, a gun-type uranium device dropped on Hiroshima. It had never been tested, just assembled and used. Fat Man, more complex and potent, was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. Both caused unimaginable destruction. But together, they were proof. Nuclear war was not just theoretical. The 3 bombs weren't just engineering marvels. They were the fork in the road for civilization, a moment when we discovered we could destroy cities from the sky, and then did exactly that. And while the world stood stunned, the Army quietly returned to its other hobby, measuring America. The Army maps the West. Cartography with bayonets. Before GPS, Google Maps, or road signs that didn't read "Here be coyotes," the U.S. Army was responsible for figuring out what exactly was west of the Mississippi. In the 19th century, during America's Great Expansion binge, it was the Army, not civilian explorers, that did the bulk of the surveying and mapping of the West. They weren't just sightseeing. These were reconnaissance missions wrapped in cartography. Surveying teams often included soldiers, engineers, and occasionally scientists who carried instruments, rifles, and a deep suspicion of the local terrain. They measured mountains, plotted rivers, and drew maps by hand, often while trying not to get scalped, starved, or stuck in a snowstorm. Their work laid the foundation for infrastructure, railroads, military forts, and future conquest. It also helped facilitate some of the ugliest chapters in American history. Like the forced displacement of indigenous peoples, every map drawn was also a boundary laid, sometimes for progress, sometimes for profit, often for power. So yes, the Army made the West navigable, but they also helped carve it up. And while they were sketching mountains across the Atlantic, the skies were about to fill with one of the most legendary fighter planes ever to loop through a dogfight. The P-51 Mustang, British brains, American muscle. One of the greatest fighter planes of World War II, sleek, fast, deadly, didn't begin as an American request. It began as a favor to the British. In 1940, desperate for modern aircraft, the British approached North American aviation and asked for a new fighter. The result? The P-51 Mustang, a plane that would become the stuff of aviation legend. Originally, it wasn't all that. The first Mustangs used an underpowered Allison engine that made it a decent low-altitude fighter and a high-altitude disappointment. Then someone had a brilliant idea. Bolt a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into it. The result? Magic. The upgraded Mustang could fly faster, higher, and farther than anything the Germans could throw at it. Suddenly, the Allies had a long-range escort fighter that could accompany bombers deep into enemy territory and still turn on a dime to tangle with enemy planes. It was the wingspan of victory, complete with 6 50-caliber machine guns. The Mustang didn't just survive war, it dominated it. And while it ruled the skies, the Navy had a quieter problem: how to work underwater. The answer? Bells. Not the musical kind, the diving kind. Diving bells. The Navy's subaquatic elevators. Before scuba tanks, before sonar, before anyone figured out how to breathe underwater without feeling like a drowning raccoon, there were diving bells, the Navy's earliest answer to the question, how do we fix stuff under the sea without growing gills? A diving bell is basically a hollow, open-bottom chamber that traps air when lowered into water. Divers could ride it down like a metal elevator to the ocean floor, where they'd exit to conduct repairs, retrieve wreckage, or stare meaningfully at barnacles. The Navy started using them as early as the 19th century, long before modern diving suits were practical. It was primitive, risky, and claustrophobic. Communication was done via ropes or tubes. Air was pumped manually from the surface. The pressure could be dangerous, and decompression was still an unsolved puzzle. But diving bells worked, kind of, and they allowed humans to go deeper, stay longer, and begin exploring the vast, silent mess beneath their ships. They weren't elegant, they weren't safe, but they opened up a new battlefield, the ocean floor. And while the Navy explored the depths, engineers were thinking bigger, much bigger. Like, what if a submarine could stay underwater forever? The nuclear submarine. Underwater for eternity. Almost. The invention of the nuclear-powered submarine wasn't just a game changer. It was a rule breaker. Before it, submarines were basically glorified snorkeling tubes. They had to surface regularly, to breathe, refuel, and remind themselves they weren't fish. But once nuclear reactors were miniaturized and stuffed into those pressure hulls, everything changed. Now, submarines didn't need to surface at all. Their only limitation? The crew's sanity and the pantry supply? A nuclear sub could stay underwater for months, undetected, traveling at high speeds, quietly haunting enemy coastlines like an aquatic ghost with launch codes. The U.S. Navy, of course, seized the opportunity. These new vessels could carry ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, entire apocalypse packages, tucked neatly inside a moving, nearly invisible fortress beneath the sea. It wasn't just about stealth. It was about second strike capability. If the homeland was wiped out, the subs would still be out there, ready to retaliate. This wasn't just strategy. It was psychological warfare with a watertight lid. And as the nuclear sub redefined underwater dominance back on land, the Army was tinkering with something far less elegant, a mechanical Frankenstein lurching across fields on legs instead of wheels, walking tanks. Because wheels are for quitters. Somewhere between science fiction and military overreach, the U.S. Army briefly flirted with the idea of walking tanks. That's right, mechanical legged vehicles meant to clomp their way across battlefields like steampunk elephants with cannons strapped to their backs. They looked like something out of a pulp novel, part tractor, part nightmare, all impractical. The idea was to create a vehicle that could handle terrain too rough for traditional treads or wheels. Mountains, forests, rocky wastelands. The logic went like this. Animals do it, so why can't machines? Engineers designed prototypes with mechanical legs powered by hydraulics and operated by, we assume, the bravest and most motion-sick soldiers available. And how did these robo-walkers perform? Poorly. They were slow, unstable, and expensive. The mechanical legs couldn't match the efficiency of wheels, and maintenance was a nightmare. Soldiers didn't trust them, and generals didn't see the point. So the Army shelved the concept, leaving walking tanks to the pages of comic books and video games. But for one brief, bizarre moment, someone in uniform sincerely believed the future of warfare involved giant steel spiders patrolling the countryside. Meanwhile, while the Army abandoned its robot legs, the space program was reaching for orbit. with a ship meant to fly, land, and do it all again. The Space Shuttle. Reusable rocket science, mostly. Enter the Space Shuttle, NASA's great reusable hope. Launched in the 1980s with all the optimism of a high school graduation speech, the shuttle was supposed to make spaceflight as routine as air travel. Cheap, frequent, flexible. It was part rocket, part glider, part cargo van for satellites. And it looked like the future, if the future had a lot of beige insulation and questionable budget math. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of throwing away multi-million-dollar rockets every mission, why not build a spaceship that could be reused over and over again? And for a while, it kind of worked. The shuttle fleet, Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, launched astronauts, deployed satellites, serviced the Hubble telescope, and helped build the International Space Station. But reality hit hard. The program was expensive, maintenance-heavy, and tragically deadly. Challenger exploded in 1986. Columbia disintegrated in 2003. The dream of routine spaceflight was stained by the realization that reusable didn't mean safe or cheap. Still, the shuttle made space feel possible in a way no other craft had. It made astronauts rock stars and gave school children a reason to look up. And while humans soared above the stratosphere, the Navy was preparing swimmers of a different kind. Men trained to crawl out of the ocean and wreck your coastline. Frogmen. The Navy's human torpedoes. Before Navy SEALs were making headlines and starring in action movies, there were the frogmen. The original underwater demolition experts, saboteurs, and sneaky shoreline specialists. These guys were the prelude to modern special operations. Swimming silently toward enemy beaches, wearing little more than fins, rubber suits, and the kind of grit that makes sharks nervous. During World War II, frogmen were part of the Naval Combat Demolition Units and Underwater Demolition Teams UD. Their mission? Swim ahead of amphibious invasions, clear underwater obstacles, blow up beach defenses, and not die doing it. They planted explosives, mapped the seabed by hand, and often operated under heavy fire, because the enemy always noticed when someone showed up to rearrange their beach furniture with C4. It was dirty, dangerous, thankless work. No one cheered the guy quietly tying demolition charges to a metal barrier while holding his breath and dodging bullets. But without them, a lot of landing craft would have hit a lot of very unfriendly objects. Their legacy lives on in today's Navy SEALs. Same ocean, same mission, better gear. And while these underwater commandos were planning explosives above the clouds, a different kind of payload was preparing to rewrite history, with a vengeance called Super Fortress, B-29. Super Fortress, the flying fortress, that ended a war. If a bomber could win a war single-handedly, the B-29 Super Fortress would be a prime suspect. This aircraft was a technological leap for its time. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, and the ability to haul devastating amounts of explosive cargo across oceans. It was designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, and it delivered with a terrible efficiency. Most famously, the B-29 was the aircraft used to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Enola Gay and Bockscar weren't just planes. They were airborne tipping points in the moral trajectory of warfare. They brought the atomic age from theory to theater. But even beyond the bombings, the B-29 was a symbol of industrial muscle and strategic scale. Flying from remote Pacific islands, these bombers carried out relentless raids over Japan, often flying missions of 12 hours or more. The crews froze, sweated, suffocated, and survived, all in a pressurized tube the size of a small bus, 30,000 feet up. It was deadly, it was dominant, and it forced the world to reckon with what war looked like when waged from the stratosphere. And yet, while some minds were focused on total annihilation, others were strapping guidance systems to pigeons. Because of course they were. Project Pigeon, guided missiles by birdbrain. No metaphor here, this was real. During World War II, famed behaviorist B.F. Skinner proposed that pigeons could be trained to guide missiles. The idea was simple. Put a pigeon in a harness inside the nose cone of a bomb. Hook it up to a screen showing the target, and let it peck its way to victory. The pigeons were trained to recognize shapes like ships or buildings. When shown a projected image of the target, they'd peck at it. Their pecks would adjust the missile's trajectory via rudimentary sensors. If the bird pecked left, the missile veered left. Right, same thing. It was primitive, bizarre, and exactly the kind of thing that makes military history both horrifying and hilarious. Amazingly, the birds were shockingly accurate. Skinner's tests showed that pigeons could track moving targets and keep the missile on course even under chaotic conditions. But the military brass, unsurprisingly, found the concept too ridiculous to take seriously, despite the data. Project Pigeon was shelved, but not because it didn't work. It was just too weird for wartime PR. Still, you've got to hand it to the military. When it comes to weapons guidance, they really did try everything, including birds with jobs. USS Monitor versus CSS Virginia, ironclads, throw the first punch. March 9, 1862. The waters of Hampton Roads churned not with wind, but with iron. In a naval duel so weird it looked like a children's drawing of two kitchen appliances fighting, the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, formerly the Union's own Merrimack, clashed in the world's first battle between ironclad warships. It was awkward. It was loud. It was historical. The Virginia was a Frankenstein of Confederate engineering, a captured Union hull refitted with sloped iron armor and a battering ram. It had already obliterated a few wooden ships the day before. But then came the Monitor, a Union response built in 100 days, sporting a strange revolving turret that looked like a soup can glued to a raft. For hours they blasted each other at close range. Cannonballs bounced off iron. Smoke filled the air. Sailors bled from concussions instead of shrapnel. And then, nothing. The battle ended in a draw. No ship sunk, no clear victor. But everything had changed. Wooden navies were obsolete. The age of iron had arrived, ushered in not by triumph, but by a stalemate. And while the ships armored themselves in metal, far away on dry land, the Army was rethinking how to save lives, not end them, on the front lines. MASH units, war's bloody hospitals on wheels. In the midst of the Korean War, as battles seesawed over mountains and valleys, the U.S. Army deployed a medical revolution. The Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, or MASH. These units weren't just tents and bandages. They were fully functional trauma centers packed into trucks, helicopters, and field shelters, all designed to be dropped into chaos and start saving lives within hours. The concept was simple. Bring the operating table closer to the battlefield. Instead of soldiers dying en route to hospitals miles away, MASH units allowed for surgeries mere minutes after injury. The result, survival rates skyrocketed. Limbs were saved. Lives were stitched back together on the edge of war zones. MASH wasn't glamorous. It smelled like blood, antiseptic, and panic. Doctors worked around the clock, elbow deep in flesh, surrounded by the groans of men and the buzz of flies. But it worked. It redefined military medicine, laying the groundwork for modern emergency trauma care. Eventually, the MASH concept would become so iconic, it inspired a hit book, film, and TV show that ran longer than the actual Korean War. But while surgeons were carving miracles in tents, global politics were carving ice with nuclear tension, and the Cold War was just getting frostier. The Cold War, a decades-long game of don't blink. The Cold War wasn't fought with tanks on fields or fleets on the ocean. It was fought in laboratories, missile silos, and anxious living rooms. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union entered a geopolitical staring contest powered by paranoia, propaganda, and the kind of military budgets that make accountants weep. It was a war without bullets, but not without blood. Proxy conflicts erupted across Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, and Africa. Each side funded revolutions, coups, and puppet governments. If someone somewhere was overthrowing someone else, odds are the CIA or the KGB had coffee there that morning. Nuclear weapons sat at the center of it all. Not fired, but always ready. Both sides built up arsenals capable of ending civilization dozens of times over. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, wasn't a joke. It was the actual plan. If one side launched, the other would respond and everyone would lose. So they didn't launch. Instead, they spied, raced to space, built walls, and lied to their own people. It was chess with live grenades. And while politicians postured in suits down in the mud, there were engineers in hard hats doing something quietly noble, building amid the bombs. The Seabees, builders with blowtorches and bayonets. The Navy's Seabees, officially the construction battalions, were a paradox in boots. Part construction crew, part combat unit, all grit. Their motto, we build, we fight, and they meant it literally. Imagine if your local home improvement crew carried rifles and could lay down an airstrip in a war zone before lunch. That's a CB. Formed during World War II, these men were engineers with shovels in one hand and submachine guns in the other. They landed just behind the Marines, often under fire, and got to work turning hellscapes into functioning bases, roads, docks, and airfields. They bulldozed jungle, poured concrete in monsoons, wired comms through bomb craters, and built entire cities in days. You'd think they'd be grim, silent types. But Seabees were famously cheerful. Smartasses with welding torches and wicked tan lines. They patched up runways while shells fell, built hospitals in swamp muck, and still found time to carve coconuts into art. Without them, the Pacific campaign would have stalled. No bases, no supplies, no war effort. And while they were hammering paradise into submission back home, scientists were hammering atoms again. This time, trying to unlock the secret to weaponized extinction in record time. The atomic bomb. Built fast, built furious. The atomic bomb wasn't just a scientific achievement. It was a sprint to madness. From the moment Einstein's letter hit FDR's desk, the Manhattan Project became a race. Build the bomb before the Nazis, whatever it costs. The result? A multinational, multi-billion-dollar effort that weaponized physics with terrifying efficiency. In just a few years, the U.S. went from theoretical papers to an actual functioning nuke, and not just one. They made 3, hello again, Trinity, Little Boy, and Fat Man, and did so in secret cities like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, where whole towns popped up overnight and everyone just pretended not to know what was going on. The project employed over 130,000 people, most of whom had no idea what they were working on. Some thought they were building parts for industrial equipment. Others just followed the paycheck. Only a select few knew they were splitting atoms in order to split reality. And when the bombs finally fell, the world was split too, into before and after. But even as the ultimate weapon was being built, the Pentagon still found time for whimsy. For instance, what if we could make a Jeep that flies? The flying Jeep lift off into lunacy. In the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. military stared long and hard at its rugged, dependable Jeep and thought, what if this thing had wings? Thus was born the flying Jeep, an idea so bold, so impractical, and so profoundly doomed that it somehow made it through multiple prototypes. Known under various code names like the Piasecki VZ-8 Air Jeep, this Frankenstein's dune buggy met helicopter. It had ducted fans, a pancake-like shape, and was meant to skim low over terrain, dodging mines and rough ground. On paper, it sounded awesome. A portable, hovering recon vehicle that could zip over jungle, swamp, or battlefield. like a cartoon dream. In practice, it flew, barely. Controlling it was hard. Pilots described it as squirrely, which is military speak for, "Dear God, why won't it stop spinning?" It was unstable, noisy, and couldn't carry much. Plus, helicopters existed, real helicopters. That worked. So the flying jeep was scrapped. But its ghost lives on in every futuristic action movie where a Humvee takes off like a drone. Because sometimes the military doesn't just test weapons, it dreams. And just as those dreams flamed out, a new kind of hope was launching. Straight into the stars and out of military hands. The Space Act of 1958. NASA steals the spotlight. By the late 1950s, space was getting crowded. Rockets were flying, satellites were beeping ominously, looking at you, Sputnik, and suddenly everyone realized space wasn't just a scientific frontier, it was a military one. Until the U.S. government stepped in and said, "Okay, enough of that. Let's give this space stuff to the nerds." Thus came the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, the law that officially created NASA. It wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a declaration. Space would be civilian, not military, at least on paper. Behind the scenes, of course, the Department of Defense still kept a hand in the galactic cookie jar, but NASA would be the shiny, non-threatening face of American spaceflight. The act established peaceful exploration as the mission. Science, discovery, public benefit. No orbital death lasers yet. NASA absorbed parts of the military space programs and began planning missions that sounded like sci-fi novels: Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. Meanwhile, the Air Force quietly muttered in the corner, still dreaming of space bombers. It was a shift in tone. From Cold War weaponization to cooperative wonder. And while NASA was busy mapping the stars, the Navy had other worries, like how to stop torpedo boats from ruining their day. Destroyers. Torpedo boat terminators. In the late 1800s, naval warfare had a problem. Torpedo boats, small, cheap, fast, were running circles around traditional warships and could sink a battleship with one lucky shot. Enter the destroyer, a class of ship invented purely to hunt and neutralize these pests. Originally called torpedo boat destroyers, subtle. They were sleek, quick, and armed to the teeth. They didn't carry giant cannons or thick armor. Their job was to zip around and intercept anything trying to sneak up on the big ships. Think of them as the guard dogs of the fleet. Smaller, meaner, and always alert. As technology evolved, so did destroyers. They gained depth charges, anti-aircraft guns, sonar, guided missiles. Suddenly, they weren't just protecting the fleet, they were the fleet. By World War II, destroyers were indispensable. They escorted convoys, screened carriers, battled submarines, and rained fire on shorelines. By the Cold War, they were floating sensor suites with enough firepower to level a city block. Today's destroyers are stealthy, high-tech command hubs that can launch Tomahawk missiles from hundreds of miles away. But back in the early 60s, no missile mattered more than the ones aimed at Cuba, and the world held its breath. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days from oblivion. In October 1962, the world stood still, not out of awe, but abject terror. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 13 days of nuclear chicken between the United States and the Soviet Union, sparked by the discovery that the Soviets were quietly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, or a short swim if you're really motivated. President Kennedy saw the photos. Khrushchev knew he'd been caught. The U.S. responded with a naval blockade. Quarantine, because blockades technically meant war. Tensions skyrocketed. One wrong move, one misinterpreted radar ping, one itchy finger, and mushroom clouds would bloom like radioactive daffodils from D.C. to Moscow. The world's most powerful men communicated through back channels, telegrams, and probably a few sweaty undershirts. The outcome hinged on diplomacy, guts, and just enough shared fear of mutual annihilation. At the last second, the Soviets blinked. They'd removed the missiles. The U.S. secretly agreed to remove theirs from Turkey. It was the closest we've ever come to ending everything over ideology, ego, and a few tropical launch pads. And yet, even while standing on the brink of extinction, the Army was busy perfecting its elite. Men with berets, bravado, and missions no one talked about. Green Berets. The quiet professionals with loud reputations. They wear green felt on their heads. But don't let that fool you. The U.S. Army Special Forces, better known as the Green Berets, are some of the most highly trained, quietly lethal individuals to ever hold a rifle or speak 6 languages. Officially formed in 1952, the Green Berets weren't built for traditional combat. They were built for the weird stuff: guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency, sabotage, psychological operations, and training foreign militias to do it all themselves. You don't join the Green Berets by accident. You endure Special Forces qualification, a soul-sanding gauntlet designed to weed out anyone lacking the brains, stamina, or mental resilience to blend into a jungle village and build an army from scratch. They're the guys you send when you don't want anyone to know you sent anyone. They operated in Vietnam before anyone admitted there was a war in Vietnam. They've embedded with rebels, toppled regimes, and done more with a radio and a translator than most armies do with tanks. Their motto, De oppresso liber, to free the oppressed. And yes, sometimes that means blowing something up, to make a point. And while they were whispering revolutions in far-flung places, American scientists were building something much less subtle. A clock so accurate, it made your heartbeat feel lazy. The atomic clock. Timing the end of the world, precisely. Built not to explode, but to measure. The atomic clock might be one of the most ironically peaceful inventions to emerge from the nuclear age. While the bomb showed how atoms could end the world, the atomic clock showed how they could measure it, down to the nanosecond. Using the consistent vibrations of cesium atoms as their heartbeat, atomic clocks keep time with almost absurd accuracy. We're talking so precise they might gain or lose a single second every few million years. Your smartphone, GPS, financial systems, they all rely on this technology. It's the unseen metronome of modern civilization. The irony? The first atomic clocks were born in military labs, developed for navigation, targeting systems, and, of course, nuclear coordination. If you're planning the exact timing of global annihilation, it helps to be punctual. Eventually, the tech passed into civilian hands, where it became crucial for satellite communications, astronomy, and even defining what a second actually is. So while nuclear fission threatened to erase humanity, nuclear precision helped us count down the seconds until it happened, or didn't. And if you thought atomic timekeeping was impressive, wait until you meet the military's next innovation. Floating blimps, hunting submarines. Blimps versus submarines. The most polite Cold War duel. During both World Wars, and even into the Cold War, the U.S. Navy employed a weapon that floated, bobbed, and looked like it belonged at a Thanksgiving parade. Blimps. Specifically, anti-submarine warfare blimps. Yes, the same general shape as a party balloon, just 250 feet long and filled with helium instead of clowns, was once the silent hunter of enemy submarines. The logic was surprisingly sound. Blimps could loiter in the air for hours, even days, cruising at low speed and low altitude, scanning the ocean below for the telltale wake or periscope of a U-boat. Equipped with radar, sonar buoys, and sometimes depth charges, these gentle giants quietly monitored coastlines, escorted convoys, and occasionally dropped a surprise on lurking submarines. They were cheap, maneuverable, and didn't need a runway. Crews operated from small gondolas underneath the envelope, often cramped, occasionally terrified. But for their slow-motion vibe, they actually got results. especially in the Atlantic. Eventually, better planes and satellites made blimps obsolete. But for a time, they floated there, fat and silent, defending the seas like airborne whales with a taste for sonar. And speaking of whales, or at least their technological descendants, it's time to revisit the moon landing. But this time, with the shocking realization that your phone is smarter than NASA's flagship spacecraft, Apollo 11's computer. A moon landing, powered by less than your microwave. In 1969, NASA pulled off one of the most ambitious feats in human history, landing men on the moon. But the real kicker? They did it with a spacecraft computer that had less processing power than a modern smartphone calculator. The Apollo Guidance Computer, AGC, used on the Apollo 11 mission, operated at roughly 0.043 megahertz. It had 64 kilobytes of memory. That's less than what's required to load an empty Google Doc. And yet, this minimalist code base and laughably primitive hardware managed to navigate a spaceship through 240,000 miles of cold vacuum, land it on a shifting lunar surface, and bring the crew back to Earth, alive, triumphant, and likely amazed that they hadn't accidentally bricked the entire mission by typing one wrong digit. During the descent, the AGC famously overloaded. Alarms blared. But instead of crashing, the software rebooted on the fly. Designed by engineers who anticipated failure and built in real-time error recovery in 1969. So the next time your app crashes while checking the weather, just remember, humanity once landed on another celestial body using a machine dumber than your thermostat. And long before digital brains and moon landings, a very analog group was busy wiring the world together by stretching cable across an entire continent, the signal corps and the telegraph line. America, now with lag. The U.S. Army Signal Corps has done a lot, from battlefield communications to early photography, to inventing ways to tell people exactly how badly things are going. But one of their biggest contributions came in the form of the first transcontinental telegraph line, a pre-Civil War marvel that strung America together with wire and determination. Before it, communication across the country meant sending letters by horse, train, or guys who really liked running. It could take weeks. After the telegraph line, you could send a message from Washington to San Francisco in minutes, assuming no buffalo knocked over a pole. The Signal Corps helped make it happen, surveying routes, building infrastructure, and laying wire across plains, mountains, and deserts. It was like threading a metal needle through 1,000 miles of chaos. Once completed, it revolutionized warfare, business, journalism, and good old-fashioned gossip. Generals could give orders from a continent away. Families could send panicked messages about missing livestock. It was high-tech for its time and helped make America feel smaller, not in territory, but in time. And while they were pioneering the art of communication, another military lab was mastering the fine art of invisibility, stealth technology. Now you see me, now you. Nope, stealth technology sounds like something out of a spy thriller, which makes sense because it was literally invented in secret. Developed during the Cold War, stealth was the military's answer to radar. What if our planes just didn't show up? Cue years of math, materials science, and enough taxpayer money to buy a small moon. The result? Aircraft like the F-117 Nighthawk and B-2 Spirit. Machines designed not to outrun enemy defenses, but to sneak past them. These aircraft are shaped like bad origami, with flat surfaces and jagged angles that deflect radar waves rather than reflect them. Combine that with radar-absorbent materials, internal weapons bays, and careful heat management, and you get an aircraft that basically whispers through the sky. But stealth wasn't just about shape, it was about strategy. Every element of a stealth mission was built around reducing visibility, altitude, speed, even the time of day. The goal was to be there, strike, and vanish, a ghost with jet fuel. And while stealth took flight, another military unit, older than the Air Force itself, was quietly reminding everyone that some traditions still involve a rifle, a flag, and a whole lot of yelling. The Marine Corps, naval infantry with an identity crisis. Technically, the United States Marine Corps is part of the Navy. Practically, they are the Navy's louder, angrier, more muscular little brother who insists on fighting everyone, everywhere, all at once. Preferably while shirtless and screaming, "Hurrah!" Formed in 1775, the Marines were originally created to serve as naval infantry, soldiers who could fight both on land and at sea, often storming beaches while ships blasted away from the horizon. Over time, though, they evolved into something else entirely, a rapid response force trained to deploy on short notice, take extreme punishment, and dish out even more. They were the first in, the last out, and usually the ones doing the heavy lifting in between. Want to land in a hostile country and secure an embassy? Call the Marines. Need to clear a jungle with a flamethrower and a toothpick? Yep, Marines. They're a branch within a branch, with their own culture, rituals, and internal logic. They eat crayons, so the jokes go. But they also train harder, bleed more, and fight like hell. And while the Navy provides the ships, the Marines provide the chaos. Meanwhile, beneath those same ships, something else was cooking. Or more accurately, fissioning. Nuclear power. The quiet core of military might. Forget diesel. Forget coal. When it comes to long-range, high-endurance military power, nothing screams modern dominance like a nuclear reactor humming quietly inside a vessel built for war. Submarines and aircraft carriers powered by nuclear energy have one critical advantage. They don't need to refuel for years. A nuclear-powered submarine can stay underwater for months at a time. The only limiting factor? Human needs. The crew will run out of air or food before the reactor even thinks about slowing down. Aircraft carriers like the USS Enterprise CVN-65, a literal floating airport, can circle the globe, project power to any coastline, and launch aircraft around the clock, all thanks to a reactor quietly boiling water deep below deck. It's not just about fuel savings. It's strategic immortality. These ships can loiter off enemy coasts for as long as politics allows, immune to fuel supply lines or logistical headaches. But there's a caveat. Nuclear power doesn't mean invincible. Reactors need maintenance. Accidents can be catastrophic. And training crews to handle nuclear propulsion is an ongoing, exacting process. Still, in a world obsessed with visibility, these machines are ghostly titans. Silent, deadly, and nearly eternal. Speaking of silent death machines, let's talk about a Cold War weapon so absurd it sounds like satire. But it was real. Project Pluto. The nuclear cruise missile from hell. If you ever wanted to weaponize the apocalypse with a bit of extra flair, Project Pluto was your guy. Born in the Cold War's fever dream era, Pluto was a U.S. program to develop a nuclear-powered supersonic cruise missile. A flying reactor with the personality of a wasp and the lifespan of an extinction-level event. Here's how it worked. A nuclear ramjet engine would use a bare, unshielded reactor to superheat incoming air, blasting the missile forward at Mach 3. It could stay airborne for days, dodge radar, and, because subtlety is for diplomats, leave a radioactive trail in its wake. Not from its warhead, mind you, just from flying, like a bird that craps radiation instead of droppings. And if that weren't enough, Pluto was designed to carry multiple nuclear bombs. It could cruise around, pollute everything in its path, and then drop warheads like toxic breadcrumbs. Fortunately, for the ozone layer and humanity, the project was scrapped. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. Even by Cold War standards, a missile that poisons everything it flies over was a PR disaster. And speaking of radar-piercing tech, it all comes back to one innovation that changed both war and weather. Radar, the war-winning invention that also ruins surprise parties. If nuclear bombs ended World War II with a bang, radar helped win it with a whisper. A scientific breakthrough disguised as a bunch of blips on a screen, radar, radio detection, and ranging, if you're nasty, changed everything. First used in earnest during World War II, radar allowed forces to detect incoming aircraft, ships, and even storms long before they became visible. Suddenly, wars weren't just fought with guns. They were fought with information. Developed independently in several countries, radar turned the tide during the Battle of Britain, where it gave the Royal Air Force an edge by revealing where Luftwaffe bombers were coming from before they arrived. The U.S. quickly caught on, incorporating radar into planes, ships, coastal defenses, and, eventually, just about anything that moved. You could say radar didn't just win battles. It invented modern warfare. It made surprise attacks harder. Night fighting became possible. Submarines had a tougher time hiding. And air traffic control? Born. Weather forecasting? Leveled up. Even your microwave, yes, that microwave, owes its existence to radar tech. Turns out, radar engineers noticed a chocolate bar melting near a magnetron. Boom. Dinner upgraded. So here we are, 103 facts deep. From flying jeeps to missile-guiding pigeons, atomic clocks to submarine ghost towns, camels, bat bombs, and astronauts golfing on the moon, American military and technological history is a sprawling fever dream of ambition, accident, and absurdity. And somehow, it's all true.